675 total days in space so far. She's about to add some more to that. But so far, she has also logged 60 hours across 10 different spacewalks. She's a two-time commander for Axiom Space, having previously also served aboard AX-2. She was also just inducted as a member of the 2025 Astronaut Hall of Fame class. So congratulations, Commander Peggy.
And seated beside her inside Dragon is our mission pilot Shubhanshu Shukla of India, whose call sign as a test pilot is Shooks. Representing the Indian Space Research Organization, or ISRO, Shooks is also an astronaut designate of India's inaugural human spaceflight effort, Gaganyaan, an Indian-built rocket and spacecraft. He was commissioned into the Indian Air Force Fighter Wing in 2006. He achieved the rank of Group Captain, in 2024, and has over 2,000 hours of flight experience aboard aircraft, including the Sukhoi 30, MKI, MiG-29, Jaguar, Hawk, and Antonov An-32.
Our third crew member is mission specialist Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski of Poland. He's representing the European Space Agency as a project astronaut coming from the reserve class of 2022, much like Marcus Want, who served as a mission specialist on AX-3. A scientist by trade, Sławomir has earned his Master's of Science with honors from Łódź University of Technology in 2008. He also has a Master's of Science from the Université de Nantes in France and a graduate engineering diploma from the Polytechnique Nantes in the same year. He also spent 2 years as the engineer in charge of the world-famous Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, beginning in 2018.
And rounding out this incredible crew is mission specialist Tibor Kapu of Hungary. He represents the Hungarian to Orbit Astronaut Program, or HUNOR. The program aims to send Hungarian astronauts to the International Space Station for scientific research and technological development, as well as to inspire young people. He graduated from the Budapest University of Technology and Economics, earning a degree in mechanical engineering, followed by a master's degree specializing in polymer technology. In 2023, Tibor emerged as one of 4 Hungarians selected from a pool of 247 candidates for the HUNOR astronaut program. He has invested a notable amount of time in his career focused on space radiation protection while awaiting his acceptance to HUNOR.
Together, they are the crew of AX-4, Axiom Space's 4th private astronaut mission to the International Space Station. This mission represents the return to spaceflight for 3 nations, but it also highlights the growing opportunities for nations and entities around the world to conduct meaningful work in low Earth orbit.
And this is an incredible crew. They have spent 10 months of training together. They reported to Houston last August and have been kind of shepherded through a variety of training efforts since then, all leading up to this moment. It has been truly an honor to see them come from different parts of the world and come together as one team.
Dragon SpaceX on Dragon to ground. The approach initiation maneuver is complete. Performance was nominal. Reminder, if the C2V2 link is lost for 10 minutes without ground action, Dragon will perform a breakout. Timers are available in your event details.
Dragon copies. Good AI and watch for C2V2 and event details.
That's a good copy. And for another status update on C2V2, ISS side is working a swap to C2V2 Bravo unit.
Good to hear. Thanks.
So that's great news as we continue in our approach of the Dragon spacecraft to the International Space Station. That first approach initiation burn, or the AI burn, ran nominally. And nominally in space talk means everything went well. So it means we're moving closer to that docking ceremony and welcoming the AX-4 crew on board.
I love it. And so we'll continue to listen in and in hopes that they will continue to progress towards docking. Obviously, there's a lot of action that has already taken place over the last 24 hours. And we'd love to share a little bit of that pre-flight effort with you that built up to launch and then towards docking. So yesterday, June 25th, the AX-4 crew was driven from quarantine to Kennedy Space Center. Here you see a photo of them at a handover event. This is a special moment where the Axiom Space Operations crew officially hands over the crew to SpaceX before they go to the Falcon Support Building to suit up. This was a moment where they got to spend a few minutes with their loved ones, with family and friends, and pause in the midst of all the operational choreography and just take in a moment about what they were about to do and to celebrate it and enjoy just this moment with loved ones. And then as this concluded, they got into the SpaceX Teslas that took them out to the Falcon support building, at which point they were officially in the hands of SpaceX.
I always think these walkout moments are so cool. Human spaceflight is really about the people on board and the people behind them. And you get this great opportunity to see their families, their friends, all the teams supporting them from around the world. Speaking of which, this is a little video we captured yesterday, right before our crew walked out to enter the Dragon spacecraft. There they are exiting the Falcon support building, which is just about a half-mile away from their launch site, which was the historic launch pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center.
That walkout moment is so iconic. It is part of every tradition of spaceflight. I love seeing it.
So is this, actually. We've got a member of our closeout crew there with our two of our astronauts headed over to the pad in those two iconic Teslas. We've got our commander there looking very happy.
Those smiles.
Yeah, the crew getting to see Falcon 9 from the base before riding that elevator up to space. You can see we're also introducing a new tradition here. Each of our crew members has a boarding pass. Peggy's is gold because she is a frequent flyer on the Dragon spacecraft. So they're presenting those to the closeout team before signing the white room wall. And then ingressing or entering the capsule and getting ready for liftoff. We did have an on-time liftoff yesterday at 2:31 a.m. Eastern. And ever since then, so now for more than 24 hours, our AX-4 crew has been on their way to the International Space Station.
Those boarding passes, as you just mentioned, are a fun tradition that adds to the layers of...
Config. We can confirm we have intercom checks for all 4 seats now.
And Peggy, could you repeat your last?
Just wanted to verify we had successful intercom checks, step 5.2, and suit donning and audio config. And we're just moving on.
Okay, I copy successful intercom checks and suit donning and audio config complete and ready to move on.
Good cut.
So you'll hear us continue to talk from mission control here at SpaceX and the big loop, right? We've got NASA in the loop now, too, as we approach the ISS, to our crew on board to perform comm checks.
And SpaceX Dragon suit donning and audio config is complete for all 4 crew members.
And to provide status updates.
SpaceX copies. 4.010 suit donning and audio config complete for all 4 crew members.
So that's particularly good news for mission control because one of the things that we have our astronauts do anytime we enter a dynamic phase of flight is put on those IVA suits. So when we talk about suit donning, they've been comfortable, right? Like we had those spacesuits on for liftoff, and hopefully we'll have some shots of liftoff from yesterday here for you in a moment. But we put those spacesuits on for liftoff, and then once we're safely in orbit, the astronauts can doff or take those suits off. But now that we're approaching the International Space Station, again, we're going to don the suits, put them back on, because we're moving into that dynamic phase of flight. So we're getting some confirmation there from our crew to mission control that we're moving forward in each of these careful steps, preparing both the capsule and the AX-4 crew for docking to the ISS.
And these are all good call-outs.
Yeah, great to hear. Yeah.
Perfect. I love it. We were talking about ingress just a moment ago. We'd love to show you shots of launch from yesterday. The teams at Kennedy Space Center, the SpaceX teams and the NASA teams, were able to get some great shots of this Falcon 9 and Dragon lifting off.
This was also the second liftoff and landing for our booster yesterday, so pretty exciting to see that flight-proven launch vehicle once again flying from 39A.
And there you have it, Grace taking to the air for the very first time.
That's a good point, Paul. This is our 5th and final Dragon in the fleet, which received its name yesterday from our commander, Peggy Whitson. Great shots of our crew there on their way up to space yesterday.
Flying with them was their zero-G indicator named Joy, and Joy has become a defining characteristic of this crew. as you saw there, the smiles and the joy on the faces of the crew members as they experienced launch, felt that acceleration, and then ultimately the lack of acceleration, the silence of microgravity at the end of all of that ascent. We then got to see them hours later on an on-orbit event as they were experiencing microgravity for the first time just a few hours ago.
Dragon, SpaceX
and here's a lovely
on
moment.
Dragon ground. ISS has completed their swap to the Bravo unit for C2V2. We're ready to try again for the big loop comm checks. If you could change your seat to destination back to ISS, and we'll give it another shot.
Inward.
So Joseph mentioned this earlier, but C2V2 stands for Common Communications for Visiting Vehicles. And what we're doing now is that final comm check as Dragon approaches the ISS to make sure that we're ready for our visiting vehicle.
Station on the big loop. We are very excited to have you loud and clear, Peggy.
And we are excited to hear your voice, and looking forward to seeing you guys shortly.
I can't wait to see you either, Peggy. Excited you guys are here.
And SpaceX copies Dragon loud and clear on the big loop.
And Houston copies SpaceX, ISS, and Dragon on the big loop.
And we have you loud and clear also, Houston.
So that was an awesome illustration of the big loop. You just heard astronauts on board the ISS talking to astronauts on board Dragon, confirmed by Mission Control here in Hawthorne, and then confirmed again by Mission Control in Houston. That is why they call it the big loop. We're literally going around the world. It's great.
We are. Everyone checking in, confirming that we're good, that we're ready to progress. And so obviously we'll continue to listen in, and hopefully that continues to call out what we need to hear to continue forward. So we were showing you shots of the crew inside the Dragon from earlier today. This is the four of them with their spacesuits off, as you mentioned. They doffed the spacesuits. This is in their other attire. And this was each of them taking a moment to speak to their country in their own language, as well as just acknowledge what it was like to see Earth
Dragon,
for the first time out those windows.
On the big loop, you are go to begin your suit leak check procedure 4.011.
4.011 is in work.
So good news there that our crew is moving forward with additional checks on board. We're obviously working a lot of different procedures here, too. You'll hear our team call out a series of different numbers. They're all carefully enumerated procedures that we step through to make sure that we don't miss anything in any of the steps it's going to take us to get to the ISS safely. Speaking of which, just in case you're just joining us, it would be good to go over many of the steps that took us to get to this point. Yesterday was launch day. Axiom 4 marks SpaceX's 18th human spaceflight launch overall. Including Axiom 4, Falcon 9 has supported 48 missions to the ISS with our Dragon spacecraft, starting with our first cargo resupply mission in 2012. And since 2022, SpaceX has supported the next generation.
Dragon, we're at step 2.2, waiting to go on suit leak check on the big loop.
We're moving through that suit leak check procedure now.
Dragon, SpaceX on the big loop, you are go to initiate suit leak check.
That's in work now.
Acknowledgement there from our commander. So SpaceX has supported the next generation of commercial space exploration so far with 7 private astronaut missions as of today, with today's AX4 mission bringing the total to 4 missions to the space station in support of Axiom Space.
I love it. So AX4 is Axiom Space's 4th mission to the International Space Station, as we've said. AX1 was the first private crew to the International Space Station. AX2 was known as the first private mission to feature government-sponsored astronauts, while as AX3 was our first all-European astronaut mission to the International Space Station. And this mission realizes the return to human spaceflight for India, Poland, and Hungary. The efforts of India are conducted through the Indian Space Research Organization, or ISRO, while the efforts of Poland are as a member of the European Space Agency, or ESA. As a member of ESA, the Polish Space Agency, Polsa, has named this mission Ignis. For Hungary, this is a mission facilitated by HUNOR, which stands for Hungarian to Orbit Program. And this mission is the first mission to the space station for India, Poland, and Hungary. And after more than 40 years, this is each country's second government-sponsored human space flight ever. Missions like these are significant for a number of reasons. Each of these commercial missions builds on the last, but they facilitate a sizable amount of public and educational outreach. Medical research, intergovernmental relationships are built and fostered through these moments, and the list goes on. To be honest, there are a lot of hard work goes into each of these missions to make sure that every minute is maximized. Ultimately, each one serves as a critical stepping stone on the path to providing global, sustained access to low Earth orbit.
Oh, absolutely. And at SpaceX, we want to help create a future where not just hundreds of people, but thousands and ultimately millions of people can travel off Earth to live and work in space and on other planets. It all starts with missions like these. It's hard to believe that it's been 5 years since Dragon radically changed how humanity gets to space, but I am very excited to see what this mission and all the ones to follow have in store. But with that, I do want to check back in with NASA at JSC. So Joseph, let's hand it back to you.
Thank you, Ronnie and Paul. And absolutely, yes, it's an incredible day to welcome the Axiom Mission 42 to the International Space Station. And I know we've already covered so many key milestones, including what it took to get to this point right now. And arrival day is always a busy one aboard the Internet.
We see 4 good suit leak checks.
And right there, another great milestone. Another great milestone right there, 4 good suit leak checks. And we talked about that earlier about during the dynamic phases of flight, the crew puts those suits on to make sure that everything is safe and sound for them to provide that extra layer of protection as they continue to chase down the International Space Station. Now, from the space station perspective, here inside the International Space Station Flight Control Room at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, arrival day is always a busy one. And this morning, with no exception, NASA's astronauts Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers are already in position inside the cupola module, and they're using specialized software to keep track of Dragon's trajectory and confirm it remains inside its designated corridor. Now, the next key milestone that we're going to keep an eye on now is a course correction or a mid-course burn that's pretty much halfway between the AI burn, which went successfully a few moments ago, and then up to waypoint 0, which is really going to start those key gates that the Dragon Grace spacecraft will start navigating on its way towards the International Space Station and docking to that zenith port, that space-facing port of the Harmony module. Now, once Dragon is docked, Nicole Ayers of NASA will be the first one to begin the hatch opening operations. She'll start by opening the large hatch on Node 2. That's that zenith space-facing port we were talking about, and that gives the crew access to the pressurized mating adapter. From there, they'll begin pressurizing what's called the vestibule. That's the small space in between the Dragon and the space station hatches. This area was exposed to the vacuum of space before docking, so it'll need to be filled with air to be equalized with both the pressure, both for the spacecraft and anyone inside the space station to equal out and for those to pass through. Ayers will then use a small valve on the station's hatch to gradually introduce air into that vestibule. And meanwhile, the flight controllers here in Houston will be closely monitoring the pressure readings to confirm that the seal is tight and everything is leak-free before giving the go for hatch opening. Now, here inside the International Space Station Flight Control Room, the controller is already hard at work. They've been doing so all morning long and well into since launch, really, and beyond. NASA Flight Director Allison Bollinger and her Athena flight team are leading operations here in the International Space Station Flight Control Room in Mission Control. And then seated to my right, to their right is the Capcom, who you'll hear communicating to the teams on the International Space Station, a part of that big loop. You heard the comms checks multiple times between SpaceX, Dragon Grace, International Space Station, and the teams in Houston, so we're all on one single line of communication. Now, taking a look at who's aboard the International Space Station, we heard them mentioned a little bit earlier on, and currently aboard is the Expedition 73 crew members. And they are led by Commander Takuya Onishi, who is on that far right-hand side. And several members of this expedition crew have celebrated some key milestones for him. For Takuya, he celebrated 200 days in space about 2 weeks ago. Up next is NASA's Anne McClain. She is sitting right in front of Takuya on that right-hand side. She recently celebrated 300 days in orbit this past week. For Nicole Ayers, just on the other side of that Expedition 73 crew patch, she recently celebrated 100 days in space on Monday, and she and McClain are going to be the ones that are going to be monitoring the Axiom Mission 4 team and dragging Grace to the International Space Station. Then NASA's Johnny Kim, a flight engineer, he is on the back left-hand side of that image. Kirill Peskov of Roscosmos, a flight engineer, celebrated 100 days in space on Monday, and Sergei Ryzhikov, flight engineer, right there in the center. And then you have Alex Zubritsky, a flight engineer of Roscosmos as well. So flight controllers here in Houston have also begun the process of feathering the station's solar arrays and looking to get that multi-step procedure designed to protect the arrays from thruster plume exposure during Dragon's final approach. Now, taking a look at the updated timelines and what we're looking forward to, we're about 7 minutes away from that AI mid-course burn, and from there about 27 minutes from that waypoint 0 mark. And then from that point on, the space station and Dragon will continue to close the gap between each other. And then about a kilometer away will be the two vehicles, and that'll be in about 13 minutes from now. So again, a lot happening surrounding Dragon Grace and the Axiom Mission 4 crew, as well as those aboard the International Space Station. We mentioned earlier that this will become a team of 11 that'll be joined together, and after docking, which right now is continuing to be adjusted, and working closer to about 5:22, approximately 5:22 a.m. Central Time. And then we'll have the hatch opening, which we just walked through the procedures of having to equalize the pressure between Dragon and Space Station so those could pass through. And then we'll have the welcome remarks shortly thereafter. So still a lot of key milestones coming up for everyone on board. But to dive deeper into that that AI mid-course burn, again, that's about the halfway point from the AI burn to waypoint 0, and that gives Dragon the ability to perform a mid-course maneuver, and that will give them to be about 400 meters or so below the International Space Station, and then of course will swing up and over top to then line itself up for waypoint 0, which will be again to the zenith port of the International Space Station. And from there, Dragon will execute a small mid-course maneuver, and that's just to fine-tune its approach and bring it to about that 400-meter mark and get ready for the remainder of its gates and those checkpoints it has to come to for the International Space Station and Dragon to eventually meet up. Now, about 90 minutes ahead of docking, attitude control of the International Space Station will be handed over to the Russian thruster system, giving the station a finer point capability as Dragon closes in. We're looking forward to welcoming the Axiom Mission 4 astronauts aboard the International Space Station. Now, as we continue to get ready for that approach initiation burn, or that mid-course burn in about 5 minutes or so, we're going to continue to check in with our teams in Hawthorne and here on the ground in Houston. As you can see right there, the process that it took for Dragon to get to the International Space Station, starting about 45 minutes after launch yesterday with the phase burn, and then that stair-step approach to get to the front door of the International Space Station with those 5 key burns leading into the approach initiation. Now, all teams on board the International Space Station have been up and at it early this morning. We talked about the roles for Nicole Ayers as well as Anne McClain getting ready to welcome the Axiom Mission 4 team. You heard the great communications between the two already as they are eager and anxious to welcome Peggy Whitson, the former NASA astronaut and commander of Axiom Mission 4. She continues her record-setting mark as the most experienced astronaut, American astronaut in the history. Currently listening into the loops of here, the teams on the ground as they're getting ready to do a go, no-go for waypoint 0 and Dragon's continued approach to the International Space Station.
We have no views, so you're going to have to keep tap dancing, and we don't have these loops in our broadcast, so you're pausing. There's no loops in the broadcast.
As we continue to follow along and continuing to tune in, we take momentary pauses just to listen into both the big loop of communications as well as the communications here in Houston and in SpaceX. As again, the team's pulling a go no go for the International Space Station side of things to get ready for Dragon's arrival to the International Space Station. As I mentioned, once the mid-course maneuver is complete, it's then on to waypoint 0 and getting them to that 400-meter mark. And hopefully we can take a look at a little bit of that graphic of what's to come for the Dragon Grace and the team aboard Axiom Mission 4. And you see there, waypoint 0, about that 400-meter mark just outside the approach ellipsoid, that 400-kilometer by 2-kilometer by 2-kilometer invisible oval ellipsoid outside of the International Space Station, one of 2 imaginary boundaries that the Dragon will have to pass through, and then of course it'll make its way onto the keep out sphere, and that's that 400-meter mark that we've been talking about, and that's where it's zeroing in on right now. So we've completed the approach initiation burn, which had them about 7 kilometers below the International Space Station, and now about 2 minutes and 45 seconds away from that mid-course burn, and we'll continue to track as Dragon and Grace continue to fine-tune itself and get ready to go and connect itself for the International Space Station. Now, of course, before Dragon is given permission to move inside the approach ellipsoid, the spacecraft configured to be known as what is a 24-hour safe trajectory. And this means that if Dragon were to lose control in its thrusters, it would be at least 24 hours before it could move inside the approach ellipsoid again. But again, those upcoming milestones, everything continuing to press on along as Dragon, so far so good, as it continues its chase down of the International Space Station. Now this maneuver continues
on the big loop. We are about 1,900 meters away and about 10 minutes out from having you jump into 1.102.
Great call outs there, as you heard the team saying, about 1,900 meters away, that all that separates the Dragon and Grace spacecraft and the International Space Station. Now, as Paul and Ronnie have mentioned, that this is the 4th private astronaut mission, the first since January of 2024, and that was when Axiom Mission 3 would arrive aboard the orbiting laboratory. Now, from AX1 through AX4, once they are aboard, the teams will have welcomed 14 different...
Copies, 10 minutes. Houston Station, copy 10 minutes until step 1 of the procedure.
And continuing to track about now 55 seconds away from that AI mid-course burn. And was saying from AX1 through AX4, the International Space Station will have welcomed 14 different private astronaut crew members representing 11 different nations, and showcasing again how private astronaut missions truly expand access to the space station for more nations, people, and opportunities. And we'll continue to tune into all of the loops here inside of the International Space Station flight control room as we await the AI mid-course burn. And now standing about 20 seconds away as it continues to fine-tune, Dragon Grace continues to fine-tune its path towards the International Space Station. And we just received confirmation that the AI mid-course burn is now in progress. And again, this is done about halfway from our starting point, which was the approach initiation burn, and that'll get Dragon on its path towards waypoint 0. It's just a small burn, but again, all about fine-tuning and its approach to ensure that we're targeting a precise point of about 400 meters directly below the International Space Station. As you can see on your screen, the team on the right-hand side is those working and monitoring the AI mid-course burn, as well as the teams on the left. On the right, that is the International Space Station Mission Control Room here in Houston, Texas. And on the left-hand side, the SpaceX teams and their Mission Control Room in Hawthorne, California, as we continue to follow along with the AI mid-course burn, now a little over a minute and 20 seconds in. And mid-course burn has just been completed, and everything has been reported as nominal.
Dragon, SpaceX on the big loop, mid-course maneuver complete. Performance was nominal. The trajectory has converged on waypoint 0.
So great news there.
And Dragon copies on the big loop.
And confirmation from Dragon Grace, and you heard Commander Peggy Whitson relaying down to the ground. And now the next milestone that we're zeroing in on is waypoint 0, which will be about 18.5 minutes from now. Is that slow but methodical approach for Dragon Grace and the Axiom Mission 4 team continues to make its way towards the International Space Station. And with that, we'll check back in with Ronnie and Paul back in Hawthorne.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Joseph. I'm loving all of these check-ins that we're getting about Dragon's progress on its way to station, how the crew is doing, hearing these call-outs from the nets. But I'm getting really spoiled today because you had great stories about the crew while we were here in kind of like our pre-show warm-up. And I would love to hear a little bit more about how you followed along the AX4 crew in like the 10 months leading up to this.
Absolutely.
And really like followed their preparations and everything that brought the crew to today.
Certainly. And so there's obviously a large team that facilitates all of the operational training flow and helping prepare them for this moment. We have a unique opportunity to document that and follow that story with them quite literally around the world over the course of all of that training. And I think it's just interesting as you get to know each of the crew members, just to understand, like, in the midst of all of this operation, in the midst of all of the timing and the coordination, there's still 4 humans inside Dragon, each with their own personalities, each with their own ambitions and characteristics, and they add to what becomes the mission.
In the crew, right?
Exactly.
Like they become one crew, which is AX4. Yeah.
Absolutely. So Peggy, I would argue, is a consummate leader. I mean, if you know anything about her, you likely know she has record after record of human spaceflight, and it is. And here we are actually seeing some views of the ISS, of the International Space Station, from Dragon. And yet, as I was saying, with Peggy, if you know her, she obviously has all of these records for human spaceflight, and it's certainly not a surprise at all that she is an inductee into the 2025 Astronaut Hall of Fame. And yet, if you get a chance to get to know her, you quickly realize she's not just about those individual accolades. She is about the team and team efforts. She wants to build teams and take them to space. And so certainly we've had the honor of following her around the world, preparing for 2 Axiom space missions, both AX2 and now AX4. And it is remarkable how she commands every room she walks in without taking over. She just exudes this steady confidence that people respond to.
Speaking of how she is commanding the capsule, we just had a great shot of her inside of the Dragon spacecraft, looking up at those touchscreen displays. And so we're going to keep bringing you views like the one we have on your screen right now of the International Space Station whenever we have ground station coverage. When we have good views, we'll obviously share them with you. This one is particularly cool because we're watching the International Space Station come into focus through a camera that is under Dragon's nose cone. So right after we got through launch and orbital insertion yesterday, we deployed the nose cone and exposed those docking hooks that we're going to use for the hard capture.
Station Houston on the big loop. Dragon range is approximately 1,000 meters. Monitor long-range approach for steps 1 to 4 in 1.102 Dragon approach and retreat monitoring. ISS crew is now primed for vehicle approach monitoring.
More of those joint communications on the big loop there about that approach that we're watching on our screen right now. It's pretty cool.
Absolutely, and it looks as though Dragon is currently underneath the International Space Station. We're looking almost up at it from underneath.
Yeah, and we had those great graphics earlier that showed how we're balancing this really careful geometry and approaching each step with these methodical burns. acknowledgement from our commander there. So we're stepping through each of these really methodical burns of those Draco thrusters on board Dragon. There are 16 of those thrusters around the spacecraft, and we use them for these careful, fine-tuned maneuvering once we get to orbit. So right now on our screen, we've got our commander, Peggy Whitson, and our pilot, Shubhanshu Shukla. And you got a chance to chat with Shukes in the lead up to this launch too, right?
Absolutely. He is such a unique, quiet force. He is witty and smart, and I tell you, 3 steps ahead of any given moment, and you don't even realize it. He's already there. He has said that his career is defined by simply saying yes, which I thought was so interesting and powerful and simple. I mean, effectively, he was saying that every opportunity, whether it was to get a chance to learn to fly or join the military or even pursue this mission, he simply said yes. And in doing so, he walked through the door and made the most of it. No matter what he's faced alongside this crew, from days of poor weather out at the Knowles expedition, which is the National Outdoor Leadership School, to processing kind of the immense volume of procedures that must be taken on and understood across all of the myriad of procedures that one must understand and become proficient on for this kind of a space flight. In the midst of all of that, he has remained calm and collected, and quite honestly, just made it look easy. And what's more, he has this unwavering spirit about him that just invites everyone around him to step up and into their roles effectively.
It's awesome to hear these stories about the way this crew really came together and everything that brought them to the mission today. For those of you who are just joining us, we have some great graphics along the base of your screen to help you follow along the mission the same way that we have been eagerly following it for the last several weeks, really, in the lead up to today. So along the bottom left-hand corner, we've got some telemetry on where our Dragon spacecraft is, including its speed and altitude. And then on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you actually see our location around the Earth. And that rightmost corner is the firing of those Draco thrusters on board. And right now we're getting great views from inside the spacecraft of our crew working with those touchscreen displays, stepping through these checklists. And now we're getting our first views from station looking down at Dragon, which is always my favorite moment of docking.
Absolutely.
Because you know that the astronauts on board the International Space Station are, we heard it in their voices earlier, are excited for this crew to be on board.
It's also one of the few moments where you really get a sense of the speed and the scale of all of this operation, right? Seeing the Earth just roll behind with those clouds, you suddenly get a sense of perspective that is just unlike anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we're doing here and why we're moving so carefully through each of these maneuvers is that, as you've noted here, these spacecraft, both the International Space Station and Dragon, are still moving really fast. So we need them to approach each other with a relative speed that's very gentle so that that docking is smooth and steady, just the way that we intend it to be. But we're still moving like 17,500 miles per hour, lapping the Earth every 90 minutes. So this is a very high speed but careful maneuver to make sure that we get our entire crew safely aboard the International Space Station.
Absolutely. Intricate, methodical, one step at a time.
There you go. Speaking of people who are particularly methodical, you were mentioning that Sławomir is like very deliberate in his actions and his lead up to everything with the crew earlier.
Sław, yes, as he likes to, as we like to call him, Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski. Is quite a lot to say. So they've quite poignantly call him Sław. He is brilliant, and I tell you, but more specifically,
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop.
I'll pause here.
Ground is go for approach 0. Burn is enabled. Maneuver start time is 9:34 Zulu. As a reminder, Dragon will nominally continue approach through waypoint 1 toward waypoint 2 without stopping at waypoint 1.
And there we have
And
another.
Dragon copies all, and we're go for the approach as well.
Another call out between Core and our commander, acknowledged by Commander Peggy Whitson.
And that was a cool call out too, because we told the crew that we're going to move right through waypoint 1. Each of those waypoints are an opportunity for us to pause and make sure that everything's going well. So that means that everything's really going on track, right? We're ready to move into this next process of approaching the station.
So we were talking about Sław, and just to finish that thought, I have often described him as somebody who is brilliant, but more specifically, he is curious. Sławomir is certainly one who is genuinely in pursuit of knowledge and understanding. I've actually never seen him to shy away from asking the next question. Throughout all the training, you can expect him to raise a hand and lean in, and everyone else does as a result. I mean, you just kind of get pulled into that earnest pursuit of knowledge, and he wraps it all up in a pretty good charm. He's exciting to learn beside. You know, I, for one, found myself wanting to lean in and learn alongside him as an outsider here. But his curiosity is probably matched only by his love for exploration and being out in the unknown. Like from sailing to hiking to kind of peering over that next ridge, he is one who is constantly seeking and experiencing something new. He has a love for this life and for this planet that is infectious. One can only imagine how that perspective is growing as he's looking out the window and seeing the Earth and perhaps even maybe the ISS at this point outside Dragon.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, speaking of his love of something new, 3 of the crew members that we have on board AX4 are first-time flyers to low Earth orbit and to the International Space Station. So very excited to hear their take on both being up there and then everything they have to share with all of us once they return. So with that, can we round out some stories here for our 4th crew member?
Absolutely. So Tibor, he is an incredible thinker. You can just see him process any information and immediately then begin to put it to use. He is someone who just grabs and goes. But also, even more than that, he's someone who really feels things deeply. He cares about what this mission is. He cares about what it means for all those back home in Hungary. He's got a very high emotional intelligence, I would say. He can read the room in an instant. But I tell you, his gift to humanity is to then be able to elevate and brighten everyone around him. I don't know of a single instructor, maybe ops team member, or even medical support staffer who doesn't smile when they think of Tibor Kapu. And I also tell you, he is tireless. There is quite a lot that he is capable of and responsible for, and that is invigorating to just see him approach every step of everything he's asked to do with diligence.
And there were a lot of steps in the lead up to this for our crew. Astronaut preparation is extensive, from training that's specific to each crew member's role to learning SpaceX protocols, space station systems, and preparing for the science and outreach activities they'll be conducting in space. Private astronaut training is pretty rigorous. So in addition to the work that they did in the field, like you mentioned with the National Outdoor Leadership School, or NOLS.
Station Houston on the Big Loop. First step, 1 of 1.102. Can you please confirm Dragon is in sight and give us an attitude assessment?
So we are standing by for that update there on the attitude of the spacecraft. Attitude, when we're talking about space travel, means the position of the spacecraft. So with that, I do want to bring it back to the training, because this crew on board AX4 spent 35 days training inside Dragon. To prepare them for flight, our teams at SpaceX spent the last several months teaching the crew about orbital mechanics and how to live inside the Dragon spacecraft. Well, this was more of a review for Peggy Whitson. For the rest of the crew, as we mentioned, this is their first time flying to space. Our training program includes nearly 100 different lessons covering all aspects of the flight. The crew spent time inside our Dragon training spacecraft to run simulations of ascent, space station rendezvous, which we are doing right now, and reentry. And they also spent time at the launch pad in our suit-up room and working through emergency procedures that would be necessary in the unlikely event of a pad abort.
And in addition to the critical training from SpaceX associated with...
on the Big Loop, come check.
Houston reads you loud and clear.
And as we were saying, in addition to the critical training from SpaceX associated with all of these dynamic phases of ascent and return, Axiom Space has facilitated a host of training efforts since August over these last 10 months to ensure that the crew and all of those who support them are ready
Station
for this
Houston
mission.
on the Big Loop. We did not copy your last.
Houston station on the big loop. We have Dragon in sight, and attitude looks nominal.
Houston copies. That's a good report.
That is a great report. It's always nice to hear those confirmations, especially across the big loop, because we are coordinating so many teams for missions like this.
Absolutely. Looking at the graphics at the bottom of the screen, you can see where Dragon is over the Earth. And from my vantage point, I believe that is just east of Africa.
I think one of the things that's the most striking to me is that as we watch all these different visuals come into play, which again, we are bringing you whenever we have them. So when we've got good views, we're sharing them with you. We're really seeing how quickly Dragon is approaching the station.
At 429 kilometers above the Earth, they are continuing to raise that elevation, that altitude, and get closer and closer to where they'll be working and living for the next 2 weeks. But again, these visuals just tell an amazing story of where we're going and what we're doing, where low Earth orbit is. It is hard to really comprehend and wrap your mind around the idea of living off planet, and yet visuals like this start to help you make that real.
Oh, absolutely. And hearing commentary like we did earlier from that on-orbit check-in, it was great to hear how quickly even the crew was saying they were learning how to do things in microgravity, especially because we have so many first-time flyers on this mission. Hopefully, first time, but not the last. We have a repeat with our commander, Peggy Whitson, as well.
Absolutely. A little bit of joy goes a long way, and overcoming some of those probably initial sensations and adjusting to microgravity. Shubhanshu had mentioned that it was taking a minute to kind of collect himself and find his space legs, but clearly they are all in good spirits and getting ready to get very active on board the International Space Station.
Which I'm sure will also be like an acclimation process, right?
Absolutely.
They've gotten used to Dragon. They've been in flight now for more than a day. All told, from launch to rendezvous at the station, we're looking at about a 28-hour flight. The time is somewhat dependent on the relative position of the International Space Station to our launch site at the time that we launch. But for any time that we're rendezvousing or meeting two spacecraft in orbit, we do have an instantaneous launch window. So we know how long that trip is going to be at the moment that we lift off. And the entire crew operations plan is built around filling that time effectively so that they're well acclimated on board the Dragon spacecraft while they approach the International Space Station. But then as soon as they get on board, we'll do our welcome ceremony. And I'm sure there's an orientation for them as well.
Absolutely.
So they have an effective 2 weeks while they're up there.
And the clock starts as soon as they get on board, right? You just mentioned the welcome ceremony. So there will be a moment once they've crossed the hatch and are officially on the International Space Station where they get to meet the other expedition crew members, have a moment to meet and greet, acknowledge the moment with a little bit of ceremony and tradition. There might even be some pinning of astronaut pins to go around. But then they get right to work. Certainly, I know that there are steps where they take to just kind of acclimate to the station, where the commander is going to take them around and make sure that they're clear on roles and responsibilities. But then again, the red line begins, and they are chasing it for the next 2 weeks, trying to accomplish a host of research efforts and outreach events. It's a full couple of weeks ahead of them.
We also have a full couple of hours here ahead of us before we get to that part.
Yes.
We are less than a minute away from approaching waypoint 0. So I do want to check back in with NASA. Joseph, why don't you give us an update on where our spacecraft is relative to the ISS?
Thank you very much, Ronnie and Paul, as we here in the teams at the International Space Station Flight Control Room tracking the arrival to waypoint 0 for Dragon Grace and the Axiom Mission 4 team, which they have just now hit that mark, which means approximately 400 meters directly below the station. And we can see those wonderful views now, and you can really see that high resolution of Dragon Grace continuing its methodical approach to the International Space Station. We're still tracking a docking time of about 5:18 6:18 a.m. Central Time, 6:18 a.m. Eastern. And you mentioned the hatch opening, and then as well as the welcome remarks shortly to follow. Hatch opening roughly about 2 hours or so after the initial contact and capture. And then when the hooks drive, the 12 hooks that are on the bulkhead there of the SpaceX Dragon will connect itself and create that hard mate, sealing itself to the orbiting laboratory. And once the pressure checks and seals will be done, then everything will be pressurized and ready to go. So waypoint 0 has been achieved, and now they're making their way on to waypoint 1. But you heard earlier on the loops that they have received the go to proceed past waypoint 1 and head straight on to waypoint 2. And that means they'll continue to swing up and above the International Space Station, and then what would have been a pause at the 220-meter mark, they'll continue to press forward and look to get to about waypoint 2. And waypoint 2's arrival will be just right on the doorstep of the International Space Station,
Dragon,
about 28
SpaceX
meters away.
On the big loop, approach 0 has started and the trajectory has converged on waypoint 1. Expect arrival at waypoint 1 at 10:09 Zulu.
Expecting arrival at waypoint 1 at 10:09 Zulu.
And there you heard it right there, that they are continuing to move on along and get ready to approach what would be waypoint 1, which that milestone will be in about a little less than 40 minutes from now. As you see right there on your screen, the Dragon Grace spacecraft continuing its methodical approach to the International Space Station. And of course, the 7 members aboard Space Station right now, looking forward to welcoming Commander Peggy Whitson, pilot Shubhanshu Shukla, as well as mission specialists Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski and Tibor Kapu to the orbiting laboratory, and a welcome back to Commander Peggy Whitson. This will be her 5th time in her 5th space flight. All of her space flights, what are the previous 3 with NASA and now 2 with Axiom Space, all key components and key missions involving the International Space Station. And you also heard on the big loop confirmations from Nicole Ayers and Anne McLean, who are monitoring Dragon's approach. They are in the cupola. That is the famed window to the world from the International Space Station that you see so many stellar views from many astronauts that share their experiences from the cupola. That is where they're using special technology to monitor and make sure that the Dragon spacecraft stays in the exact corridor, and that makes sure that everything is remaining on track and stays in its expected zones. Now, as we continue to march towards waypoint 1, and again, they will bypass waypoint 1 unless they need to make that pit stop to make sure everything is fine-tuned and ready. Once Dragon continues through waypoint 1, waypoint 2, and then eventual capture, Nicole Ayers will be the primed NASA astronaut to start the hatch opening process. And that'll begin by opening the large hatch on the Node 2 Zenith port. That is the port facing outer space, and that gives them access to the pressurized mating adapter. And there, Ayers and McLean and company will then move in and make sure that everything is sealed up once checks have been done and the relative dampening motion has been removed between Dragon and its connection to the International Space Station. And Ayers will pressurize the vestibule, and that is the small space between the hatches of the Dragon spacecraft and the space station. Now, that vestibule has been exposed to the vacuum of space, and that was all due to prior to docking. So the crew will need to fill it with air to make sure its pressure is nearly equal with the atmospheric pressure on Dragon and in the station. That pressure, similar to what we experience here on Earth at sea level, about 14 psi is what they need to bring it up to, again, from the vacuum of space. And that's where Ayers will use a small valve on that station's hatch to slowly introduce the air into the vestibule, and flight controllers here in Houston will monitor and verify that pressure readings, and everything is making sure to be leak-free before we get ready to open up the hatches. As you can see, Space Dragon Grace making its way with the nose cone open, and you can see that strobe in the middle. And it's always fascinating to watch. Now during an orbital daytime, you can see the sun shining brightly on the spacecraft and the thrusters firing, and you can follow along in that bottom right-hand corner which thrusters are being activated again to fine-tune Dragon's path to the International Space Station. But seeing that strobe, always fun when it illuminates from the Dragon perspective on the International Space Station, and we may get some of those great views closer to docking. And again, that docking time tracking closer to 5:18 a.m. Central Time, 6:18 a.m. Eastern, and that is where the soft capture will connect, and then the hooks will drive. The 12 hooks in 2 sets of 6 will drive and form the hard mate and bring Dragon and the space station closer together before the leak checks, the umbilicals for communication and power, everything will be connected, and then the pressurization of that vestibule from NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers and team will begin. About 36 minutes from now, Dragon spacecraft will reach its waypoint 1 mark. And again, that's where the spacecraft will swing up and above the International Space Station, as it'll be docking to the space-facing or zenith port of the Harmony module. And you can see great views again of Dragon.
On the big loop per block Bravo, Dragon attitude is as expected.
Houston copies. Thank you.
And great communications there. Is everything going to plan for Dragon Grace? And you can see those thruster firings, those plumes of gases that are helping the spacecraft navigate its way from waypoint 0 to waypoint 1, and as mentioned, it's going to go up and over top of the International Space Station and then align itself to that zenith port, and then it'll make its way onto waypoint 2. As mentioned previously, all visiting vehicles that arrive to the International Space Station take this phased approach when going to the orbiting laboratory, stopping at those predetermined gates. And that's for teams here on the ground, both in SpaceX and in Houston, to run quick checks on vehicle performance before approaching the laboratory. And there you can see that strobe effect that we were talking about just a moment ago as it illuminates the views from the International Space Station looking at the Dragon Grace spacecraft as it continues its methodical approach to the station, as they are now just in the southernmost regions of Australia and making its way into the Pacific Ocean. Both Dragon and station just began an orbital nighttime period, so we'll continue to lean on that strobe effect on the spacecraft to follow along. As Slow and Steady continues to win the race for these docking operations between Dragon and the International Space Station, and of course always requires a great deal of precision to make sure that we're keeping the spacecraft and the crew safe. And there's a great look inside of Dragon Grace, and then the view from the spacecraft now looking to the International Space Station, and those slight glimpses of daylight left before both the orbiting laboratory and the spacecraft completely enveloped in darkness during the orbital nighttime period. You can see the radiators. That's what's most prominent in the view of the International Space Station. And at the very top of this view of the International Space Station, you can see what was Dragon Endurance. That is the Dragon spacecraft vehicle that Crew 10 took to the International Space Station back in March. So upon docking, and once everyone is settled, you will see the International Space Station flying with both Grace and Endurance, and 5 total vehicles connected to the orbiting lab. View inside of the Dragon spacecraft, and you see from just over the shoulder of Peggy Whitson and Shubhanshu Shukla, the commander and pilot, as they are continuing to monitor the progress of the spacecraft, and there the final faint views of the International Space Station before the orbital nighttime period. And as mentioned, these two chasing each other just off the southeast coast of Australia as we speak. And a great view of that center screen there where you're seeing Dragon lining itself up with the International Space Station, and the views that both pilot Shubhanshu Shukla of ISRO and Peggy Whitson, commander of Axiom Mission 4, are monitoring. Now approaching about 31 minutes until we reach waypoint 1. And once the spacecraft reaches waypoint 1, it'll be about 220 meters away, a little more than 656 feet from the orbiting laboratory, is Dragon Grace on its inaugural flight, looking to connect up to the International Space Station. Before we reach waypoint 1, which will be in about 30 minutes from now, the teams here on the ground, about 10 minutes outside of that milestone, will conduct a go, no-go poll, which we've been talking about throughout today's broadcast, just that step-by-step process, that slow and steady methodical maneuvering of the spacecraft to connect to the orbiting laboratory. And we're continuing to follow along for an approximate docking time of 5:18 a.m. Central Time, 6:18 a.m. Eastern. And the only light you're seeing from that shot was bouncing off of the International Space Station and what it provided, but now inside Dragon Grace and its Axiom Mission 4 crew of Peggy Whitson, commander, Shubhanshu Shukla, pilot. That's who you see in the field of view there, just that over-the-shoulder shot as they monitor Dragon's maneuvering towards the space station, but also joined alongside by mission specialist Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski and Tibor Kapu, respectively, of ESA and Hunor. And as we continue to take a look at the orbital nighttime phasing of the International Space Station and the Dragon Grace spacecraft, you see those thruster firings continuing that methodical approach for the craft. But you can also see in that left-hand side the speed of which they are traveling, the Dragon spacecraft at that, as it makes, again, it's starting to steady out, and that slow push towards the orbiting laboratory, 428 kilometers above Earth. Once aboard the orbiting laboratory, the Axiom Mission 4 crew will participate in about 60 research investigations representing 31 countries, and more than 24 of those experiments supported by the ISS National Laboratory. And there's a live look at the teams here on the ground. On the left-hand side, that is Mission Control in SpaceX, Hawthorne, California, following along with Dragon's progress, I should say. And on the right-hand side, it looks to be Axiom Space here in Houston, just down the road from Johnson Space Center, NASA's Johnson Space Center, where we are located. And the International Space Station Flight Control Room, all three teams working together in integrated operations. That began just before we went live for today's broadcast. We're all three monitoring the progress of the Dragon spacecraft to the International Space Station. And you've been hearing communications on what is the big loop, which is that single line of comms that allow for the Dragon spacecraft and Grace to communicate with the International Space Station, but also for the teams on the ground here in Houston and in California and Hawthorne, all to communicate together. So everybody on the same page as the spacecraft continues its push towards the orbiting lab. We are about 26 minutes away, a little bit north of that, until we reach waypoint 1 for Dragon Grace. As you can see, some of that telemetry and data populating the screens inside of the spacecraft that the team on board are carefully monitoring. And this is the view from the Dragon spacecraft looking up at the International Space Station, as these two now making their way into the southernmost regions of the Pacific Ocean, having just passed underneath the south and then the southeast of Australia. They will continue into an orbital nighttime period until they reach roughly about the east coast of North America, and then you'll get some of those great views of the sunlight radiating over top of both of the craft. So far, everything performing nominally for the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft as it continues its push towards the International Space Station, and what's been quite the journey for them. You heard earlier that this, since launch all the way up to the anticipated docking time, will be about a 28-hour process, 29 hours or so. So a lot has happened in a short amount of time as the teams in Hawthorne, California on the left and the teams on the right-hand side in Axiom Space working together with those here in Houston. And those teams right now communicating with each other on those internal communications loops that we monitor and follow along with as they now prepare the teams for waypoint 1 about 24 minutes from now. The go no go for that will be in about 15 minutes or so. And we'll keep an ear out for those comms as, again, Dragon starting to slow down its approach towards the International Space Station, a very methodical journey that all started shortly after launch, what was yesterday morning at 1:31 a.m. Central Time, 2:31 a.m. Eastern. That saw the Axiom mission 4 team reach orbit and begin its journey to track down the International Space Station, the 4th private astronaut mission, and the first since January of 2024, when Axiom mission 3 would join the expedition aboard the orbiting laboratory. On board the International Space Station, the crews, they were up and got right into preparing for Dragon's arrival. NASA's Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers, who you've heard at times on the big communications loop talking to all parties. They are in the station's cupola using specialized software to track Dragon's approach and making sure it stays in the expected zones with that orbital nighttime currently enveloping the station and the Dragon spacecraft. They're keeping a close eye, and of course from the space station perspective, and we'll see it as we receive video communication, that strobing effect, that strobe light on the front, and that forward nose cone of the SpaceX Dragon to help illuminate its path and help keep track. Earlier, we also received that as the Dragon spacecraft makes its way towards waypoint 1 about 22 minutes from now, that the teams on the ground were looking to bypass this milestone, but will again do a go no go poll, make sure everything looks exactly as it should before allowing that bypass of the spacecraft and then its maneuver up and over top of the International Space Station and then proceeding onto waypoint 2. And a great graphic of the International Space Station, and just below it, the Dragon spacecraft is, again, they are making their journey across the Pacific Ocean, traveling over 26,000 kilometers an hour and 420 plus kilometers above the Earth's surface. We've been talking about that methodical approach for the Dragon spacecraft that started immediately, or 45 minutes or so immediately after launch yesterday morning, in which they would execute a series of burns from the phase burn to the boost burn, co-elliptic or close burn, transfer, and co-elliptic burn. Those 5 burns allow for the stair stepping of Dragon to climb up in altitude, but also to close the gap, the distance between the International Space Station and the spacecraft itself. And that is what's led us up to this morning. The approach initiation burn started just shortly after the start of this broadcast, in which Dragon, in integrated operations with SpaceX and NASA working together with Axiom Space, all monitoring closely as Dragon Grace continues its way towards the orbiting lab and looking to turn a crew, the Expedition 73 crew of 7, into a total of 11, a full house above the orbiting lab. Now inside 20 minutes to the waypoint 1 arrival. And about 10 minutes or so, the teams here inside Houston, as well as and SpaceX in Hawthorne, California, will continue to monitor and do the go, no go for waypoint 1. And if everything is on track, they'll continue to proceed through waypoint 1 onto waypoint 2. And waypoint 2 has them right on the doorstep of the International Space Station, about 20 meters out when they arrive to that waypoint, a little more than 65 feet away. If you are just joining us, we are continuing to follow along the progress of Axiom Mission 4 and the 4 astronauts aboard, Commander Peggy Whitson, pilot Shubhanshu Shukla, and mission specialists Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski and Tibor Kapu, the 4th private astronaut mission and the first since January 2024 to make its way towards the International Space Station, in which they will spend approximately 2 weeks doing research investigations and outreach activities, expanding commercial space. We are tracking a docking time of approximately 5:18 a.m. Central Time, 6:18 a.m. Eastern. The next key milestone that we are keeping an eye on is the arrival of the spacecraft to waypoint 1. And to gain perspective, waypoint 1 will be about 220 meters away between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station. And that's the second checkpoint. They have already reached waypoint 0 to begin this process. Waypoint 0, waypoint 1, and then on to waypoint 2, which we mentioned is about 20 meters away.
Okay, spur, you said downlink 6.
Great views there from the International Space Station, looking at the Dragon Grace spacecraft, that strobe light illuminating its path, as well as the port and starboard side lights. The red and green that you see on your screen is both the International Space Station and Dragon Grace in an orbital nighttime period. They're actually crossing over the Pacific Ocean, about to cross over the equator, and then eventually make its way over the west coast of North America. We'll start to see the spacecraft and the International Space Station once again become illuminated with an orbital sunrise. In a few more moments, that'll occur as they continue their journey over the Pacific Ocean. And for the Dragon spacecraft, approaching waypoint 1, now about 15 minutes from that point. And we'll continue to bring those great views as you see that slow and steady progress of the Dragon vehicle as it continues to track down the orbiting laboratory. And on your screen, you see the speed and altitude, where it is over the Earth in current relation. But on that far right-hand side, that's the thruster firings. And you just see those illuminate every so often as Dragon continues to fine-tune its path towards the International Space Station. And this mission since launch approaching now 1 day, 3 hours or 3.5 hours of time. That's the time you see in the middle there, the T plus. 1 day, 3 hours, 28 minutes and 40 plus seconds. As the crew aboard, anxious and ready to join the Expedition 73 crew aboard the International Space Station. And as we take a look at those crew members and introduce them to you, that'll welcome the Axiom Mission 4 team. They're led by Commander Takuya Onishi of JAXA, the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, who just recently celebrated about 2 weeks ago his 200 days in space. Anne McLean, NASA flight engineer, will be there as well. Her and Nicole Ayers, the two NASA astronauts monitoring Dragon's approach to the International Space Station. For McLean, celebrating 300 days in space last week. And for Nicole Ayers, this past Monday, celebrated 100 days in microgravity. They're also joined by NASA astronaut Johnny Kim, flight engineer, and Roscosmos cosmonauts Kirill Peskov. For Peskov, he would also celebrate 100 days this past Monday as a part of the Crew 10 team. And then Roscosmos cosmonauts Sergei Ryzhikov and Alexei Zubritsky also joining the cadre of 7 astronauts and cosmonauts aboard the International Space Station. We mentioned earlier, this is the 4th private astronaut mission to the International Space Station, and the first since January of 2024, since Axiom Mission 3. From the Axiom Mission 1 now through Axiom Mission 4, the International Space Station will have welcomed 14 different private astronaut crew members representing 111 different nations, and showcasing how these private astronaut missions truly expand access to the space station for more nations, people, and opportunities. And we talked about this crew, in approximately their 2 weeks on board the orbiting laboratory, will participate in around 60 research investigations representing 31 countries, with more than 24 of those experiments sponsored by the ISS National Lab. In about 2 minutes, we'll monitor the loops and keep an ear out for the go, no-go poll on the ground for teams that'll be monitoring Dragon's approach to waypoint 1. And that waypoint will be reached in a little less than a dozen minutes, 12 minutes from now. This is Mission Control Houston as we are continuing to monitor the Dragon Grace spacecraft and Axiom mission 4, the private astronaut mission, as it continues its approach to the International Space Station. They have moved past waypoint 0 and are now on its way to waypoint 1, the second of 3 checkpoints or 3 gates for this journey for the spacecraft to the orbiting laboratory. We just received update that the new anticipated docking time, approximately 5:30 a.m. Central Time, 6:30 a.m. Eastern, as the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station teams here on the ground, both in Hawthorne, California for SpaceX and inside of NASA's Mission Control Houston and the International Space Station Flight Control Room, continuing to work together in communication and relay those updated data and projections and trajectory and all the information needed. So again, that docking time has been updated to now approximately 5:30 a.m. Central, 6:30 a.m. Eastern. And the flight control teams here in Houston and listening in on the loops on overall communications have just pulled go for Dragon's approach to waypoint 1, and they will reach that milestone waypoint 1 in about 9 minutes from now. This waypoint will have the spacecraft 220 meters away from the International Space Station, a little more than 656 feet. And once it reaches that docking access, an additional go-no-go pole will be created, in which the teams will then pull for the arrival of the spacecraft to waypoint 2. And given the go there, Dragon Grace will move to within 20 meters and a little more than 65 feet from the orbiting laboratory. And earlier we also had communications that if everything goes to plan and Dragon continues to remain on its trajectory, that they would bypass waypoint 1 and go straight from 0 to waypoint 2. But once it arrives to waypoint 1, this will be the point in the spacecraft's journey in which we will be on what we call the docking axis, which will essentially mean that it is directly in front of the docking port that it'll connect itself to. The crew are right now heading to the space-facing port on the International Space Station, node to zenith of the Harmony module. That zenith meaning it is the side of the space station facing space. So its journey brings it from underneath the International Space Station, Dragon Grace, to swinging up and over top of it, and then arriving at that docking access en route to waypoint 2. We'll continue to bring views of the International Space Station and Dragon Grace spacecraft as we receive them, as the two continuing their chase to connect up as they're now making their way towards the western coast of North America in an orbital nighttime configuration. And we've seen views of the Dragon spacecraft in that orbital nighttime with the strobe lights shining bright. Once it gets closer, it'll actually illuminate the International Space Station and allow for greater views of the docking port itself that it'll connect to. And again, that node 2 is zenith port of the Harmony module of the space station. And that anticipated docking time that has now recently been updated to 5:30 a.m. Central, 6:30 a.m. Eastern. Teams on the ground have pulled go for Dragon's approach to waypoint 1, and that arrival to that checkpoint will be a little more than 5 minutes from now. The crew inside Dragon Grace Axiom Mission 4. They are in their launch and entry suits and are ready to continue their journey towards the International Space Station. And there you see it, the view from the orbiting laboratory, looking at Dragon Grace. As you see that strobe light we were just mentioning, as it gets closer, will illuminate the side of the orbiting laboratory, as well as the port and starboard lights, the red and green. Crew in their launch and entry suits, providing that extra layer of protection and pressure, and that happens, are in them during these dynamic phases of flight. Now inside 5 minutes from waypoint 1. When Dragon docks to the International Space Station, there will be 5 spacecraft connected to the orbital outpost, and we'll bring the crew up to 11 crew members, and the overall total of the International Space Station to 288 visitors since 1998. They will join the Dragon Endurance spacecraft that brought up Crew 10 back in March. They will also join with the Soyuz MS-27, a spacecraft that brought NASA astronaut Johnny Kim to the International Space Station in early April. And then 2 cargo craft, Progress cargo craft from Roscosmos also aboard the station, and then eventually the Dragon Grace spacecraft, as we get now views inside of Dragon Grace and looking over the shoulders of Commander Peggy Whitson and pilot Shubhanshu Shukla of ISRO. And you see them adjusting their monitors as the approach continues on for Dragon. And then a great view in the middle of the screen there of the path Dragon is taking. Last time we saw inside, it was more towards the left-hand side of the screen, in which Dragon now flying up and over top of the International Space Station. And now we get great views from Dragon Grace, and there's the strobe light. You can see it ever so faintly illuminating the International Space Station as it continues.
Station Houston on the Big Loop. Dragon is transmitting docking camera video. Please confirm video and data updating in Dragon Docking Monitor. Also, we have a new docking time of 10:30.
Copies. We are seeing data on the Dragon Docking Monitor, and we copy 10:30 for the new docking time.
Houston copies.
Great communications there on the Big Loop between the teams in Houston and SpaceX, talking to Dragon Grace and the confirmations of the updated docking time. You heard the words 10:30. That's 10:30 Zulu, which Central Time is 5:30, as we had mentioned, 5:30 a.m. Central, 6:30 a.m. Eastern, as we return to that exciting view from Dragon looking up at the International Space Station. You can ever so faintly see the solar arrays coming into view, and that strobe light illuminating the radiators, which are right along that central portion and angling upward. The International Space Station and the Dragon spacecraft now approaching the west coast of North America, right around the Seattle area, that border between the United States and Canada, as we are approaching 1 minute away from waypoint 1, the second checkpoint and second series of waypoints for the spacecraft to reach to. The teams have already pulled go, but we will listen for the call outs for that waypoint 1 arrival.
Dragon SpaceX on the Big Loop, approach 1 and soft capture ring extension will begin shortly. Dragon will continue approach to waypoint 2. As a reminder, manual impulsive retreat recovery is not permitted.
And Dragon copies all.
And there you heard communications on the Big Loop about that soft capture ring And that is the initial contact that will occur between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station, a soft capture, with that soft capture ring then retracting and the 12 hooks that will drive and connect and form a hard mate between the spacecraft and the International Space Station. From there, power communications will then be connected up, and NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers will make her way into the pressurized mating adapter and get ready for hatch opening procedures, which will require bringing the vestibule, the space between the two hatches, between the International Space Station and Dragon Grace, together. And there we see the orbital sunrise making its way over top of the International Space Station as they continue their pursuit of each other, now angling over at North America. And there in the center screen, if you look at the topmost, the Dragon now perfectly aligned over top of the International Space Station, now looking down at that Node 2 Zenith port, and a great view just off the bottom portion there. That is the Dragon Endurance spacecraft that it'll be just alongside of. So Dragon has reached waypoint 0, and on initial comms earlier that the teams on the ground, once reaching waypoint 1, have been allowed to bypass that waypoint and now move on to waypoint 2, which will be in about 9 minutes from now, and targeting docking in about 14.5 minutes from there. Go, no-go polls for docking in about 7 minutes as the teams on the ground continuing to monitor Dragon's progress. And once they arrive to waypoint 2, there will be a pause, make sure everything is lined up just perfectly before that final approach and docking. This is Mission Control Houston as Dragon Grace and the spacecraft carrying Axiom Mission 4 and their 4 astronauts continuing their approach to the International Space Station. They have just made their way past waypoint 1, which had them at 220 meters away from the space-facing port of the International Space Station's Harmony module. And now on the path to reach waypoint 2, teams on the ground have concurred or agreed that they will take a brief pause at waypoint 2, which is 20 meters away, to make sure everything is aligned precisely. And there you see the view from Dragon and that newly illuminated International Space Station as the two craft navigating its way over North America, coming into an orbital sunrise and daytime period.
and station on the big loop. Dragon attitude is still as expected, and station is ready for docking.
Houston copies. At waypoint 2, Dragon will briefly pause to align for docking, then automatically resume approach.
Station copies.
Commentator Rob.
You just heard great communications on the big loop from Station and Dragon, as well as the teams in Houston and in Hawthorne for SpaceX and NASA, as the Dragon Grace spacecraft continuing its approach to the International Space Station, carrying Axiom Mission 4 Commander Peggy Whitson, pilot Shubhanshu Shukla of ISRO, Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski of ESA,
Dragon
and
SpaceX
Tibor.
soft capture ring extension complete. Dragon will continue through waypoint 2 without a hold.
Second copy, no hold at waypoint 2, and good rating extension.
Great communications there. They were anticipating a brief hold to make sure everything aligns, but Dragon Grace continuing on what has been so far so good. A great rendezvous with the International Space Station. They will proceed to continue past waypoint 2. And you also heard in the communications with NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers, the station ready for docking. And a great view of the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft making its glacial approach to the International Space Station. And the view from the space station looking up as it approaches the space-facing or Node 2 Zenith port of the Harmony module. We are about 4 minutes away from the waypoint 2 arrival, which again they are expecting to move right past through without a hold. That is at the 20-meter mark, and proceed right on into docking, a soft capture, and then soft capture ring retraction and hooks to drive. And that capture, about
Dragon
8 minutes
SpaceX
and 47.
on the big loop, ground is go for approach 2, and approach is now allowed. Reminder, ensure that visors are closed prior to Dragon's departure from the waypoint. Once Dragon is inside the crew hands-off point, retreat and breakout are not permitted.
Dragon copies, and we have visors down, and we are go for docking as well. And copy on the approach. Inside 2, chop.
SpaceX copies, visors down, SpaceX crew is go for docking.
All great communications there as the communications from the ground up to the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft, as visors are down on the 4 astronauts inside as they continue their approach to the International Space Station, now nearly 7 minutes away from that initial contact. Dragon and the International Space Station now making its way over the northernmost territories of North America and Canada, and heading towards the Atlantic Ocean, as we are now 7.5 minutes away from the approximate docking time, as Dragon will move smoothly past waypoint 2, about 20 meters away. And continuing its fine-tuning and approach, you see little plumes coming off the spacecraft. Again, those are those thruster firings continuing to inch and adjust the spacecraft towards the orbiting laboratory. Dragon continuing to get bigger and bigger from the viewpoint of the International Space Station as waypoint 2 about 90 seconds away, and there it'll be just a mere 20 meters away. And there the spacecraft will focus on aligning its docking system with the docking adapter and then fly in to make the initial contact and give us what we will call that soft capture, or the soft capture ring will retract. And then the hooks will drive to form the hard mate. And that capture, or that initial contact, coming in about 6 minutes from now.
Yes, they have. I can press them. They switch it up.
Approaching 30 seconds away from waypoint 2 arrival, in which the Dragon spacecraft will be about 20 meters away, just called out 30 meters, so continuing its close in to the International Space Station. Dragon Grace now 25 meters away. Dragon has now reached waypoint 2, 20 meters away from the International Space Station, and will continue its approach to the International Space Station. And there you can see a great view of that zenith port, that space-facing port on the International Space Station's Harmony module. As the Dragon spacecraft right now sitting at waypoint 2, just 20 meters away.
Houston station for step 4 in block Bravo. Dragon attitude is as expected.
Houston copies. Station Houston on the big loop. Dragon is on final approach and is go for docking. Monitor per steps 5 and 6 and 1.102.
Houston copies, monitoring for steps 5 and 6.
And there you heard it. The final steps relayed up to the crew for final approach and docking have been given as we continue to see Dragon Grace spacecraft close the gap between them and the International Space Station. Now, just before the spacecraft reaches the international docking adapter for that soft capture, you'll hear the call out CHOP, or crew hands off point, which Dragon will continue its journey and make that initial connection, that soft capture, in those final few moments.
SpaceX Dragon, 10 meters.
10 meters.
inside 10 meters, a little less now than 30 feet away, is all that separates Dragon Grace from the International Space Station.
Five meters.
5 meters.
Meters. Chop.
2 meters. Station. 2 meters. Chop.
We have chop.
1 meter.
1 meter. Dragon contact and soft capture complete.
Dragon copy.
Dragon Grace and the Axiom Mission 4 crew have arrived to the International Space Station at 5:31 a.m. Central Time over the North Atlantic as the two orbiting around the Earth, connecting with the soft capture ring. And now we'll begin the ring retraction to bring the two vehicles closer together, and then the 12 hooks, the two sets of 6, will drive to form a hard nut. And there you heard there, the soft capture ring is retracting, and then we'll do so until sensors are indicating it's time for those hooks to drive in place and give us a hard capture and firmly secure Dragon to station. And again, Axiom Mission 4 and its commander Peggy Whitson, pilot Jubanshu Shukla of ISRO, and mission specialist Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski and Tibor Kapu of ESA and Hunor have arrived to the International Space Station with contact at 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern, as the two were orbiting over the North Atlantic. The soft capture ring, that initial contact between Dragon Grace and the International Space Station, continuing to retract, and we'll await for the calls that the sensors read that it'll be time for those 12 hooks on the Dragon to then begin driving and connecting itself to form a hard mate to the International Space Station.
Ring retraction complete. Docking sequence is holding for MCS reconfiguration.
This is Mission Control Houston, as you are seeing a live view of the recently connected Dragon Grace spacecraft with the Axiom Mission 4 astronauts and Peggy Whitson, Shubhanshu Shukla, Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Tibor Kapu arrive to the International Space Station. Soft capture and contact at 5:31 a.m. Central Time, 6:31 a.m. Eastern, as the two were orbiting above the North Atlantic. And right now, the two mated with that soft capture, the soft capture ring retracting to pull the spacecraft closer to the International Space Station. And once given the go, the ring or the hooks around the Dragon nose cone will drive and connect to form a hard mate. Teams on the ground in both Houston.
Station Houston on the big loop. MCS configured, proceeding with hook driving.
Station copies.
And the great call there, that's the next step in this docking procedure, is the driving of the hooks, the 12 hooks surrounding the nose cone or the nose of the Dragon spacecraft. And we'll monitor those. They'll drive in 2 sets of 6. The first set of 6 right now, they're traveling, and we'll continue to follow along as the docking process continues on. And then after that first set of 6, the second set will drive and connect Dragon to form a hard mate to the International Space Station. And once the docking is complete, NASA astronauts Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers, who have been monitoring from the International Space Station from the cupola of the Dragon's arrival, it'll be Ayers that'll begin the hatch opening or hatch operations. And that'll start by opening up the main hatch on the Node 2 Zenith section of the Harmony module. That's what you see Dragon connected to. And what's separating that module and the Dragon spacecraft is that and continuing to monitor that first set of 6 hooks forming that hard mate. And once the full set of 12, Ayers will continue the docking procedures with the leak checks and then begin making its way into the pressurized mating adapter. That's what you see between the Harmony module and the Dragon spacecraft, and access into there to then what we begin pressurizing the vestibule, that small compartment between the 2 hatches. And that vestibule has been exposed to the vacuum of space prior to Dragon Grace's arrival. So the next step is to carefully reintroduce that air and pressure inside so it matches both that of the station and the Dragon spacecraft. And we just received confirmation that the first set of 6 hooks have driven and closed, and we'll now begin the second set of 6 to continue that hard mate between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station. If you are just joining us, this is Mission Control Houston, where Axiom Mission 4 aboard the Dragon Grace spacecraft have connected to the International Space Station at 5:31 a.m. Central Time, currently in the process from soft capture to the hard mate to the orbiting laboratory. First set of 6 hooks have closed, and now monitoring that second set of 6, 12 in total, to form that hard mate.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, hard capture complete.
Dragon copies. Hard capture complete.
And we just heard confirmation there. All 12 hooks have closed, and that is a hard mate to the Dragon Grace spacecraft and the International Space Station, completing from soft capture to that hard mate. And these So the soft capture ring retraction in progress, and then it'll be on to establishing umbilical connections between the spacecraft and the International Space Station. That'll allow for the transfer of communications and power through those umbilicals. So we're Dragon, you see that upper portion that's mostly black against the vacuum of space, but that's the solar arrays to provide Dragon power. Once those umbilicals are connected, that power will then be provided by the International Space Station, and communications will have that hardline connection with the umbilicals as well. And once those umbilicals have been connected, that'll complete the docking process, and that's when NASA astronauts Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers, namely Ayers, will jump into action and begin the leak checks and hatch opening procedures. And that'll allow the pressurization of the vestibule, the space between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station, to be brought to pressure equal to that of what is inside station and inside the Dragon spacecraft, about 14 psi, what you experience here on Earth as sea level. And then from there, the hatch operations will continue. And the Axiom Mission 4 team will make its way on board the International Space Station with welcome remarks soon to follow. Soft capture ring has now been stowed away, and the umbilicals are in motion again to connect Dragon Grace and the International Space Station, providing that communications, that direct line of communications and power.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, docking sequence complete. Ground will be enabling hardline power and comm connections shortly. You are go to DOF suits per procedure 4.012 and begin post-docking cabin configuration per 4.400 in parallel.
Dragon copies. Docking complete. 4.012 and 4.400 are in work. And Grace is happy to be on Harmony.
Grace Station, we are excited to welcome you. Peggy, Shug, Suave, and Tibor, we cannot wait to open the hatch and give you guys a hug. We'll see you soon.
Looking forward to it.
And Axiom 4 from Houston, welcome aboard the International Space Station. It's an honor to have you join our outpost of international cooperation and exploration.
We are honored to be here. Thank you.
Very exciting moment for all those aboard. This is Mission Control Houston, and an exciting moment for all of us here at NASA's Johnson Space Center and the International Space Station flight control rooms, as well as the teams in Axiom Space, also in Houston, and in Hawthorne, California, and SpaceX as Axiom Mission 4, the private astronaut mission with Peggy Whitson, who you just heard talking on the big loop, the single line of communications between all four parties, sharing her excitement as she returns to the International Space Station, bringing up first-time flyers and pilot Shubhanshu Shukla of ISRO and mission specialist Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski of ESA and Tibor Kapu of Hunor. Contact between the two, between Dragon Grace and the International Space Station at 5:31 a.m. Central Time. And now that the hooks have connected, all 12 and umbilicals deployed, providing power and communications. Now the team inside the International Space Station, namely Nicole Ayers, is going to start beginning the hatch opening procedures. And now that we're docked, she will secure some hardware and then move right into those operations. And first we'll open the large hatch at the Node 2 Zenith, or the space-facing port side of the Harmony module. And that's what you see, similar to where that NASA logo is. That's the Harmony module that the pressurized mating adapter is jettisoning up into and connecting to the Dragon Grace spacecraft. And then from there, she'll traverse into that pressurized mating adapter and we'll begin pressurizing the vestibule, which is that small space between the hatches on Dragon and the space station. And we have talked about this has been exposed to vacuum prior to docking. And we'll need to fill that space with air to make sure that pressure is equal with the atmospheric pressures on Dragon and the International Space Station. Also putting away some hardware in the process, including the docking across. And Ayers will use a small valve on the station's hatch to slowly introduce that air into the vestibule. And flight controllers here in Houston will continue to monitor the pressure and temperature readings inside and verify that everything is A-OK and leak-free before we get ready to open up the hatches. From that capture moment, which again was 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern over the North Atlantic. It takes roughly about 2 hours to get everything pressurized and checked out before we open up the hatches and welcome in Axiom Mission 4 to the International Space Station.
Commentator and producer
SpaceX Dragon on the big loop. Com check on the cabin mic.
Peggy, I have you loud and clear on the cabin mic on the big loop. Dragon, SpaceX on Dragon aground. That call on the cabin mic actually came over Dragon aground.
Thanks for the catch. We reconfigured.
This is Mission Control Houston as we continue to follow along the progress of the contact capture and beginning of hatch opening procedures as Axiom Mission 4 has arrived to the International Space Station with contact at 5:31 a.m. Central Time. The soft capture and ring have been retracted and stowed away. The 12 hooks around the nose, the bulkhead there of the Dragon SpaceX connected to the pressurized mating adapter have latched on to create the hard mate. The umbilicals have been extended to allow for Dragon to run on power and communication lines provided by the International Space Station. And now looking at approximately 8:35 a.m. Central Time for welcome remarks, and shortly after the Axiom Mission 4 team make their way through the hatchway and into the International Space Station. The docking procedures between the soft capture ring, the hooks, and umbilicals have been completed.
Station on the big loop. Node 2 overhead hatch is open.
Houston copies.
And a good call there down from NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers saying that she has opened up the hatch for the Node 2 Zenith way, the space-facing side of the Harmony module, to give her access to the pressurized mating adapter. And there she will cruise in to begin work on the hatch opening procedures and pressurizing
Station and
the vestibule.
Dragon Houston on the big loop. We are troubleshooting the big loop audio comm issues from earlier, and the action we're about to take will take down big loop comm between ISS and the Axiom crew for about 5 minutes. We may require additional comm checks after.
Station copies. Dragon copies.
Communications there on the big loop between the teams here in Houston and up to the International Space Station as they troubleshoot some communications, and the big loop that you have been hearing that have connected everyone here inside of Mission Control Houston and the International Space Station Flight Control Room, those aboard the space station and inside the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft, and the teams in Hawthorne, California, those 4 parties, that's the big loop. They will troubleshoot those communications for about 5 minutes and then recheck. But you heard just prior to that NASA astronauts Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers have begun the hatch opening procedures, in which the large hatch at the Node 2 Zenith, that's the space-facing side of the Harmony module, has been opened, and that will allow for them to begin the hatch opening procedures and pressurize the vestibule, which is what, in addition to the comms checks, we will monitor, as Ayers will use a small valve on the station's hatch to slowly introduce air into the vestibule. That's the gap between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station that has been exposed to vacuum. And from there, they will match the pressure, the atmosphere inside both station and Dragon. And this procedure for a hatch opening usually takes about 2 hours or so to perform leak checks and make sure every connection and everything is safe and sealed.
On the big loop. In step 2.4, the time is 10:56. The APAS equalization valve is back closed.
Houston copies as a good config. Expect at least 15 minutes before we continue.
Station copies.
And that communication between the International Space Station and the International Space Station Flight Control Room, and you heard the word APAS hatch. That is the hatch, again, that they will be operating and looking to open up from the space station side. But in doing so, they will need to pressurize, as we've been talking about, the vestibule, and then allow for the atmospheres to match between the Dragon Grace spacecraft and Axiom Mission 4 crew, the vestibule itself, and the International Space Station, all equal throughout to allow for the parties to pass through for the hatch opening and eventual welcome remarks. The contact for Axiom Mission 4 to the International Space Station about a half an hour ago at 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern. And as they continue to configure the hatch opening procedures for NASA astronaut Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers, between the two of them, we'll continue to work those procedures, and we'll hear those communications throughout in anticipation of Axiom Mission 4 and Commander Peggy Whitson making her return to the International Space Station, her 5th flight, second as a member of Axiom Space and the commander of Axiom Mission 4, and her previous 3 as a NASA astronaut servicing key missions to the International Space Station. And a big part of the coming up in November, 25 years of continuous operations and humans on board the orbiting laboratory. And there she will welcome also first-time flyers and pilot Shubhanshu Shukla of ISRO, Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski of ESA, and Tibor Kapu of Hunor for Shukla, Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Kapu representing India, Poland, and Hungary. This will be those nations' first time visiting the orbiting laboratory. And with that, from Axiom Mission 1 through Axiom Mission 4, the International Space Station will have welcomed 14 different private astronaut crew members representing 11 different nations, showing how private astronaut missions truly expand access to the International Space Station for more nations, people, and opportunities. And on your screen, you see the clock counting upwards at the bottom, the T+, that is 1 day, 4 hours, 28 minutes, and now
SpaceX Dragon.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. Dragon SpaceX ComCheck on Dragon ground.
SpaceX Dragon from the cabin mic on Dragon to ground.
Peggy, I'm with you on Dragon to ground.
Okay, here. Did you call for me, or did I misunderstand?
I was returning your call.
Okay, stand by for inventory.
Copy, standing by.
comm checks and communications there between the teams in Hawthorne, California and SpaceX and the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft. as we heard earlier that they were troubleshooting some communications and looking to bring back on the big loop that connects the teams on the ground in SpaceX and NASA, as well as the teams in the International Space Station and the Dragon spacecraft itself.
SpaceX Dragon 4, inventory reporting on Dragon to ground.
And I'm with you on Dragon to ground. We are about to enter a LOS period for about 4 minutes, so we'll need to stand by.
Communications between SpaceX and the crew aboard the SpaceX Dragon Gray spacecraft saying they are upcoming on a period of LOS, or loss of signal, that's anticipated as the International Space Station and the spacecraft orbiting around the Earth and transfer of satellite signals. Right now they are making their way over the southern Indian Ocean and about to head into a period of orbital nighttime, as we will get back views as soon as we have them. And again, the spacecraft carrying Axiom and Mission 4 and the 4 private astronauts contact with the International Space Station at 5:31 a.m. Central Time, and expected to continue with hatch opening procedures as they have already driven the hooks, connected the umbilicals for power and communications, and NASA astronauts Nicole Ayers and Ann McLean working on those hatch opening procedures as we speak. And that will allow the crew to make its way from Dragon into the International Space Station, going from a crew of 7 aboard the orbiting laboratory to a crew of 11. And that'll be followed by welcome remarks at approximately 8:35 a.m. Central Time, 9:35 a.m. Eastern Time. Certainly an exciting moment for all of us here in Mission Control, but we want to check back in with our team over in Hawthorne as Axiom Mission 4 has arrived to the International Space Station.
For as many times as we have had the privilege of supporting crews headed to and from the International Space Station, I'm certain that it is an incomparable experience. Something that unless you're on board, you can't possibly understand what it really feels like. Paul, and I'm confident that you and I cannot do it justice even attempting to tell everyone joining us today about it. So instead, we have invited Axiom Space's own commander, Michael Lopez Alegria, to share from his previous experiences.
LA, MLA, or Commander, you've got a few designations, right? For those who may not know.
How you doing, Paul? Good to see you, Ronnie.
Hey, it's good to see you as well, sir. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Yeah, good to be with you.
So for those who may not know, I've got to share a few stats here just to make sure people understand who we have joining us today on the show. You've flown to space 6 times, 2 of those to Dragon, on Dragon for Axiom Space. You've got a running total of, say, 296 days, 16 hours, and 15 minutes, give or take or so, in space. You've conducted 10 EVAs over the course of your career, and when you're not in space, you're helping get others at Axiom Space to space, right? As our chief astronaut. Do I have all of that right?
Sounds good. I'm not sure about the minutes and seconds, but everything else sounds right.
That's awesome. Well, we want to spend some time with you and just ask you some questions about your experiences getting to the International Space Station. Obviously, you know a thing or two about rendezvous and docking. So the first question is simply, we've just watched Dragon Grace dock to the space station. You've done this several times. What's the mindset for a crew at this point in the mission?
So as we get closer and closer, you know, we're transitioning from the phase where you're basically waiting to get to the ISS, and you're laser focused, especially the last 220 meters from what they call waypoint 1 into docking. A lot of focus on what's being shown on the displays. We have several parameters that we're monitoring: closure rate, the what they call the corridor, et cetera. There are a few things that could cause the system to stop or retreat or even break out, which means you come back and try to rendezvous on another day. So that's really what's going on, at least technically, I guess, in your mind. Obviously, emotionally, it's a completely different story. You know, you've been in there. In these their cases, they've been in there for almost 30 hours since launch. Not a ton to do, and so they're very eager, I'm sure, to get aboard the ISS and start working.
So for you, on your missions, say AX-1 and AX-3, what was this moment of the anticipation of the hatch opening? What was that like for you and your crew?
You know, like a lot of spaceflight, it's very busy, and you're trying to juggle a couple of different emotions. I mean, obviously, one is you've got a lot to do. They're getting out of their suits. They're putting on their flight suits to get across. They've got some reconfiguration of the onboard systems to take care of. So on that plane, you're sort of focused on the task at hand. But secondarily, you're thinking, again, a lot about, what it's taken to get here, what is this going to be like when I float aboard the ISS for the first time. So there's an emotional component that is also pretty strong. A lot going on.
So backing up even further, before you get to that kind of emotional moment of crossing the threshold, tell me a little bit more about the journey to get to that point. We, on this end, get to see launch, ascent, and then spacecraft separation. But after that, as you mentioned, you're kind of on your own. What are some of the hallmarks of your transit up to the station?
Yeah, as you know, Ronnie, from the time of post-orbital insertion, when the Dragon is configured for on-orbit operations, until you really start the approach initiation, you're basically playing catch-up. And I heard it very well explained by John yesterday on the broadcast during launch, that it's basically you're on the same lane as the ISS, but now you've got to catch up. And the way we catch up is by having an orbit with a lower altitude than the ISS. So we actually go around the Earth a little bit faster each time. And with each lap around the Earth, we get closer and closer. And so there's not a ton to do. Those maneuvers to adjust the orbital altitude, we call them burns. They happen, first of all, automatically. Of course, we are monitoring when they're going on. But between those things, there's not a ton to do. The Dragon is a very efficient spacecraft for what it is meant to do, which is transit to get you from the Earth to the ISS. But it's not really cut out to be an on-orbit anything, really. So you're just sort of hanging out. They'll have they will have had a sleep period while they wait to get there. But there isn't a ton to do between those maneuvers, and so it's really kind of a hurry up and wait. Again, a lot like a lot of human spaceflight, very intense activities, followed by some pretty long lulls occasionally.
And so then when do you get to go from that free-flying, like transit mode to the rendezvous and docking phase?
Yeah, so after that series of maneuvers to change the altitude, we start approach initiation. And I would say that the transition is really when the spacecraft starts pointing at the ISS. Until then, the attitude is really optimized for power and communications considerations. But when it gets beyond a certain point, it starts actually looking at the ISS, and then you start being able to pick it up in the displays through the forward-looking cameras that are on board.
L.A., you've described the moment of getting into microgravity as you've transitioned into another plane, another world, another moment. Can you share a little bit of that thought, that mindset, as you transition from, obviously, the acceleration of launch into microgravity and being in that other world? I'd love to hear your perspective on that transition.
Yeah, you know, Paul, it's interesting. I mean, it really is kind of like a parallel universe in a way. We all live our lives in 1G pretty much our entire lives. But when you make that transition, it really is a very different sensation. For the first time you feel it, you can't even believe it. I mean, it's a little bit like the zero-G airplane that we are trained in, but of course, instead of lasting 20 seconds or so, it lasts effectively forever. And so that sensation, I mean, it just brings a smile to your face when you let go of something and it just stays hovering in front of you. And it just never gets old. It's really quite remarkable.
I love it. And obviously our crew in Dragon right now is in that other plane, in that other world of microgravity being constant. So we're walking forward. We're progressing towards this moment where the hatch will open and they are going to enter the space station. You've mentioned this already a little bit, but I'd love to just kind of unpack that some more. What is it like to just kind of float through that hatch and realize you're no longer in Dragon, you're now in the station?
Yeah, think about the experience that these guys have had. I mean, they've been training in mock-ups that look just like the ISS, but you're obviously walking around in there. You're not floating. So now they've experienced microgravity, but in the fairly confined spaces of the spacecraft. Once the hatch is open, it's a special moment, and you, as a commander, you really never get to see it because generally they go in first. But you can just feel their wonder as they float across the hatch, and they are actually in that environment that on the one hand looks so familiar, but in a different way feels very different because now you're floating and not walking through it. It's a similar experience, and I remember on AX-1 when the three first-time flyers saw the Earth from the first time from the Dragon spacecraft after we got into orbit. And again, I didn't see their faces because they were glued to the windows, but I could just feel, hear, and sense how excited they are, and it's a magical feeling. And I'm looking forward to to trying to perceive what that must be like for these three as they float aboard the ISS.
One of the things we're really looking forward to with this crew is the welcome ceremony that's going to be today at 8:35 a.m. Central. Tell us a little bit about the history or the tradition associated with welcoming a new crew on board.
Yeah, that goes back obviously 25 years or so when we first started having handovers aboard the ISS. But recently what we've done is added a pinning ceremony to that, and that is where Peggy, as a commander, will provide astronaut pins to the three new flyers, Shuk, Slav, and Tibor. And those pins will have a number associated with them, which is the number of orbital astronaut they are. So they will be the 634th, 35th, and 36th humans to have orbited the Earth in the history of humanity. So when you think about it, it's a pretty small number considering humans have been around quite a while. But it's pretty nice, and of course, to be greeted by the onboard crew, all 7 of them, lots of hugs, lots of different languages being spoken, and a lot of smiles.
And so then after you have this great welcome moment, sharing all of that across different cultures, different teams, how quickly do you transition then to working together on station?
Pretty quickly. You really have to hit the ground running. There are a few safety things that we go through with the ISS commander where they'll tell us some things that, of course, they have learned in the mock-ups again, but now this is for real. These are where things are located. This is what we expect you to do if this or that goes wrong. And then really it's off to work. We start transferring a lot of cargo out of the ISS. Most of that will be to support various scientific experiments that we're bringing on board. And then our lives get ruled by what we call the Optimus Viewer, which is basically a moving map of your schedule from the time you wake up to the time you go to bed. And it's pretty hectic. You've got, in this case, 14 days to get a lot of stuff done. Every detail is pre-programmed by the teams on the ground working with NASA. And we really have an effort to try to maintain that pace. Obviously, it takes a bit of time to get accustomed to floating around. Even though they've been in zero-G for over a day, they haven't been in zero-G in such a big open space. And so moving around, you've heard the term or the phrase slow is smooth and smooth is fast. They definitely will be practicing that. So there's a little bit of time for adaptation. There's quite a bit of time with the safety briefings that I mentioned. But after that, it's looking at Optimus Viewer and really getting started.
LA, you've just mentioned that schedule is full and you jump right on into it, trying to stay ahead of that red line in that Optimus map you mentioned. But I'm curious, just looking back at AX-3, your previous mission, what were some of the highlights for you personally on board the space station?
We've learned a lot since AX-1 and the progression through AX-3, and I think one of the things we learned is that we really need to focus the commander's time on being available to the other crew members. So I would say one of the most gratifying things is giving them the time and space to sort of inhale, exhale, think about what they're doing, and take their time, because really the planners have done a great job fitting all of these activities into these 14 days, and there is enough time to do it. It doesn't do anybody good to get flustered and upset. You just go one step at a time, and then letting them have a little bit of time to look out that window, because that is a view that is spectacular and unforgettable. I think my advice to the crew would be, you have a huge responsibility. Your families, your colleagues, your space agencies, your nations are really counting on you. But at the same time, try to enjoy it. Try to really soak this in. This is generally a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And again, it's that balance between, you know, sort of the focused, hard nails, technical work, and trying to really absorb the emotional experience, which is obviously very unique.
Unique indeed. You just mentioned there that there's lessons to be learned that you share out with each of the crew members. And I know that you got a chance to do that with this crew and ahead of their launch, I believe, in quarantine. So I'm curious if you could share some of those lessons learned with us. If you were preparing to take us up next, what would you share with us?
Well, the good news is that, you know, Peggy has done this a time or two herself, and her crew will probably be as ready as anyone that you can imagine. So my time with this crew was pretty short and pretty informal because of A, her experience, and B, the training that, as I mentioned, has evolved since AX1 to the point that I think we have it pretty well suitcased in terms of what to train, what not to train, and how much of each. Again, my advice to them is try to absorb it, try to be as cognizant of what's going on, because it is that parallel universe, again, that's hard to get to. And the more of that you can sort of soak away in the recesses of your mind, the better. Because I'm quite convinced that this crew in particular is extraordinarily well trained, and they'll have no issue getting through their timeline and all their activities that they have to do. I just want them to think about the stuff that they can do and take advantage of the amazing experience that they're having.
Commander, thank you so much. We truly could spend the next hour talking space with you. Thank you for sharing your time and your perspectives with us this morning.
You bet. It's been a pleasure. All the best.
Thank you. You too. With that, we're very excited to hand the ball back over to NASA Johnson Space Center, where we're going to get a further update on the progress on board station and our AX4 crew. Joseph?
Thank you very much, Ronnie and Paul. We appreciate it, and great interview there with Michael Lopez Alegria.
Dragon copies.
And a great update right there to bring us right back into what's been happening and all the key milestones of the hatch opening process and the docking process for Axiom and Mission 4, its team on the Dragon Grace spacecraft, and have connected to the International Space Station. You heard that power and the connection with the umbilicals. Everything has been established. A hard mate has been created after the initial contact and soft capture connection and ring retraction. That was at 5:31 a.m. Central Time, so a little less than an hour ago. And we are still on board, as Ronnie, as you mentioned, tracking that welcome remarks and welcoming the crew formally on board the International Space Station around 8:35 a.m. Central Time. So far, everything's still being worked on in terms of those hatch opening procedures as the Dragon spacecraft has connected itself to the Node 2 Zenith port, or the space-facing port of the International Space Station, and we'll bring you back those views as soon as we have them, as we are continuing our coverage all the way up until those welcome remarks and bringing on the Axiom Mission 4 team, the fourth private astronaut mission to the orbiting laboratory. On board the International Space Station as we speak, as you heard, those comms checkouts and power and communications checkouts continuing to roll on along. NASA astronauts Nicole Ayers and Anne McLean, who monitored Dragon's progress throughout the morning, from the approach initiation burn all the way through to the contact and capture, They are beginning those hatch opening procedures, and we'll continue to look at the APAS hatch and the pressurized mating adapter. That's the space that separates between the International Space Station and the Harmony module and the Dragon spacecraft itself. And in there, those series of hatches, the APAS hatch is, and the vestibule, of course, is what needs to be pressurized to allow for the APAS hatch on the International Space Station side to be opened and stowed away. And then from that angle, then it'll allow for the Dragon team to open up their side of their hatch. And once the pressure is equal between Dragon, the vestibule, and the International Space Station, that'll allow for the crew to come on board the orbiting laboratory and bring the crew, the Expedition 73 crew, which right now is a crew of 7, and welcome in their guests, Axiom Mission 4, and bring up the total to 11. There you can see on your screen the International Space Station and the Dragon spacecraft together orbiting over the southeasternmost portion of Australia, and they are in an orbital nighttime period right now, and that'll stretch on for another few more moments, and we hope to have those great views of the space station and the Dragon spacecraft once the sunrise and orbital daytime has returned. And again, tracking an 8:35 a.m. Central Time welcome remark, and shortly before then, you'll see the crew, and we'll have all that coverage and views of the Axiom Mission 4 team making its way into the orbiting laboratory. And again, a great interview there with Michael Lopez Alegria, commander, former NASA astronaut and commander of Axiom 1 and Axiom 3, and the ISS, the International Space Station, ready to welcome in Peggy Whitson, a former NASA astronaut, on her 5th flight, second with Axiom as commander of Axiom 2 and now of Axiom Mission 4, and bringing in pilot Shubhanshu Shukla of ISRO, Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski of ESA, and Tibor Kapu of Hunor, each representing India, Poland, and Hungary respectively. It'll be the first time that those 3 nations have been on board the International Space Station, and that'll bring 14 different private astronaut crew members representing 11 different nations to the orbiting lab, showcasing the strength of private astronaut missions and how it expands access to the International Space Station and low Earth orbit for more nations, people, and opportunities. So we continue to follow along with the hatch opening procedures that Nicole Ayers and Anne McLean of NASA each working diligently through, and we'll continue to provide updates as they arrive. During that interview, we did hear that there was some troubleshooting that they were working on the big loop that has since been resolved. So we should hear communications on that big loop that connects both the Dragon spacecraft, the International Space Station, and the teams on the ground here inside of Mission Control Houston and the International Space Station Flight Control Room at NASA's Johnson Space Center, and well, the teams in Hawthorne, California, and the Mission Control Room at SpaceX. Currently on board the International Space Station. Oh.
Station Houston on the big loop for PMA.
Houston Station, go ahead on the big loop.
Hey, we're about to get you into your next activity, but in the meantime, would you mind setting up a video of the PMA so that we could watch the crew ingress? You can use the Node 2 Camera 1 or Camera 2.
That doesn't work.
Thank you.
Communications from the ground here in Mission Control Houston up to the International Space Station, that PMA, pressurized mating adapter, and that is where NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers is currently operating in the hatch opening procedures, and they're asking to set up a camera so we can get live views in and witness the Axiom Mission 4 crew as they ingress or enter the International Space Station. So we will keep an eye out for those views coming from that pressurized mating adapter just inside the Zenith, Node 2 Zenith port of the International Space Station, that space-facing port. Before those communications, I'm going to say aboard the International Space Station as we speak, the 7 members of the Expedition 73 crew, featuring Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers, who are prime characters in today's docking operations, joined by Takuya Onishi of JAXA and Kirill Peskov, alongside NASA astronaut Johnny Kim, Sergei Ryzhikov, and Alexei Zubritsky. You heard during the interview with Michael Lopez Alegria some of those key milestones and celebratory moments that he celebrated in his time as the commander of Axiom at Mission 1 and Axiom Mission 3 earlier, bringing those first-time flyers in Shubhanshu Shukla, Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Tibor Kapu into microgravity for the very first time. The International Space Station also featuring first-time flyers Nicole Ayer and Kirill Peskov, alongside with Johnny Kim and Alexei Zubritsky for Ayers and Peskov. They recently just celebrated their 100th day in orbit this past Monday.
You actually have both Node 2 cameras on. You guys are welcome aboard.
Fantastic. Those are great views. Thank you.
And there you see the live view that the team on board the International Space Station has just set up for us to see as we are inside the pressurized mating adapter looking into what will be the APAS hatch that will eventually be pressurized and the vestibule pressurized, pardon me, to welcome the Axiom Mission 4 crew aboard once everything is equal in pressure from SpaceX Dragon to the vestibule to the International Space Station, and the hatches on the Dragon and Space Station side are open. Everything will be on schedule to welcome in the 4-member crew. And the, again, welcome remarks tracking for approximately 8:35 a.m. Central Time, 9:35 a.m. Eastern. And you heard Michael Lopez Alegria talking about the pinning ceremony that will take place during those welcome remarks. I'm looking forward to seeing those as the team aboard the International Space Station continuing to work through their hatch opening procedures. Since launching from Launch Complex 39A and NASA's Kennedy Space Center yesterday morning at 1:31 a.m. Central, 2:31 a.m. Eastern, the Axiom Mission 4 crew above the newly named Dragon SpaceX Grace spacecraft have tracked down the International Space Station through a stair-stepping procedure of multiple burns that occurred from just moments or a few moments after launch up until the early morning hours today, to allow them to catch up to the orbiting laboratory and set up for the final approach and docking. And that contact with the orbiting laboratory at 5:31 a.m. Central Time. And from that point on, it takes about 2 hours or so to allow for the hatch opening and hard mating procedures to be complete, umbilicals to be run, power and communications to be connected. And once everything is set, that's where you'll begin to see the hatch opening procedures and lead up to those welcoming remarks. And as you're following along with us, as we continue to wait for views of the International Space Station and the Dragon spacecraft as they are in an orbital nighttime period, making their way across the Pacific Ocean and approaching the equator, almost right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. We'll get those views back from the exterior cameras. And the astronauts on board the International Space Station continuing to configure the cameras for views inside the orbiting lab. If you are just joining us, you are watching live coverage of the docking of Axiom Mission 4 to the International Space Station, the fourth private astronaut mission to the orbiting lab and the first since January of 2024. Docking has occurred, and that was exactly an hour ago, 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern. And now with Axiom Mission 4 attached to the International Space Station, docking and leak checks and hatch procedures and opening procedures continuing to move along. The crew aboard the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft going through their procedures, as well as the 7 members of the Expedition 73 crew who are in the middle of their workday, and namely NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers and Anne McClain, who oversaw today's approach monitoring from the cupola of the International Space Station, that window to the world that you see so many wonderful views from. And Nicole Ayers currently working in the space-facing hatch of the Harmony module, where on the other side of the APAS hatch and vestibule is the Dragon SpaceX spacecraft. Ayers will use a small valve on that station's hatch to slowly introduce air into the vestibule. That's the space between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station. That area has been exposed to vacuum of space, so that needs to be brought up to 1 atmosphere, or about 14 psi, what we know here on Earth as the pressure at sea level. And the flight controllers here in Houston will continue to monitor that pressure and temperature readings inside and verify that everything is leak-free before we go ahead and open up the hatches. Just received communications from the team here inside the International Space Station Flight Control Room that the vestibule leak check has been successful, and it is good. So they will continue to move forward with the hatch opening procedures. And again, you heard in the interview with Michael Lopez Alegria, slow is smooth, smooth is fast, as these teams making sure everything is sealed up and safe as they continue through hatch opening procedures.
Station Houston on the Big Loop. We are doing some more troubleshooting for the C2V2 audio issue, so Big Loop is going to be down for another 5 minutes. In the meantime, you are go to pick up in step 3.1 of 2.102, and NASA TV should be available on VME TV now.
There you heard communications radioed up to the crew aboard the International Space Station on the Big Loop that they are continuing with the troubleshooting of that communications as we are looking live up towards that node to Zenith hatch in the Harmony module, and you see several members of the Expedition 73 crew in and out of the field of view. That is Nicole Ayers going into the pressurized mating adapter and continuing hatch opening procedures, and she is wearing the long-sleeved navy polo. And the red polo that just flew by, that is Expedition 73 Commander Takuya Onishi. We've also seen glimpses of Anne McClain in the field of view as well as certainly everybody aboard the International Space Station anxious and excited to welcome Axiom Mission 4 with Commander Peggy Whitson, pilot Shubhanshu Shukla, Mission Specialist Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Mission Specialist Tibor Kapu aboard the orbiting laboratory. This is Mission Control Houston. If you are just joining us, you are following along with live coverage of the docking and soon-to-be hatch opening and welcome remarks of Axiom Mission 4 to the International Space Station. The mission began with the launch off of Launch Complex 39A and NASA's Kennedy Space Center yesterday morning at 1:31 a.m. Central, 2:31 a.m. Eastern. That took them on a journey that was a little more than a day to get them to the orbiting lab. They have since docked, and contact was at 5:31 a.m. Central Time. And after the connections made, the hooks driving to form the hard mate, umbilicals with power and communications connections all run. Now it is those hatch opening procedures and leak checks that the crew is currently working through aboard the International Space Station, while the crew aboard
Station
the
on 2 for step 3.2, seeing about 0 for the DVTT, looking for your go to continue.
We see the same. You're good to proceed.
And continued communications as Nicole Ayers once again floating into that pressurized mating adapter and continuing those hatch opening procedures to welcome Axiom Mission 4. The target welcoming remark ceremony time, 8:35 a.m. Central. So a little more than 2 hours from now as leak checks and pressurization checks continue on before the APAS hatch and the vestibule and all procedures can be completed. And a great view of some of those procedures as Nicole Ayers again. You can see her with that right hand turning the crank and working on that hatch to continue those procedures.
Dragon Station, this is Houston on the Big Loop for comm checks.
Dragon has you loud and clear. Dragon on the Big Loop. We have you loud and clear.
And Dragon, we read you the same.
Great communications checks there as the teams on the ground continuing to work on those communications between the International Space Station and the ground, as well as the teams here in Mission Control Houston and Dragon, as we are watching live inside of the International Space Station up into the Node 2 Zenith hatchway as NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers continuing with her hatch opening procedures. Docking of Axiom Mission 4 to the orbiting laboratory. occurred about an hour and 10 minutes ago at 5:31 a.m. at Central, and since then the crews for both station and inside Dragon have been going through those procedures and making sure everything is as it needs to be, including the proper leak checks and stowage from both perspectives, before continuing on with hatch opening procedures and welcoming remarks. We'll continue to provide updates, and you'll hear calls on the big loop of all four parties: NASA's Mission Control and the International Space Station Flight Control Room, SpaceX in Hawthorne, California, and the teams and the Expedition 73 crew aboard the International Space Station, and Axiom Mission 4 aboard the Dragon and Grace
Dragon Houston on the
spacecraft.
big loop. Stand by for hardline audio config.
Dragon copies.
Also a part of these procedures, and once hatch opening continues to move along, the crews will install IMV ducting to help mix the air of the space station environment with the air inside of Dragon and seal up some of those lithium hydroxide cartridges that scrub the carbon dioxide inside of the Dragon spacecraft. And that was on their ride to the International Space Station. They'll also check some vent valves as we go, and maybe need a little bit more time on board, but these last final checks are crucial to make sure everything is good to go, since it will remain docked to the International Space Station for nearly 2 weeks. With the arrival of Axiom Mission 4 and the Dragon Grace spacecraft, newly named and given by Peggy Whitson, commander of Axiom Mission 4, shortly after launch yesterday morning, that now brings 5 spacecraft to the International Space Station: 2 Dragon spacecraft, a Soyuz MS-27 spacecraft, and 2 Progress vehicles, cargo vehicles, attached to the orbiting outpost. For Dragon, it is Endurance and Grace, connected to the forward and now zenith ports of the Harmony module, with 2 Progress vehicles and that Soyuz MS-27 also connected. And once the Axiom Mission 4 crew makes its way aboard station, that'll bring, since 1998, 288 visitors to the orbital outpost. Nicole Ayers, NASA astronaut, has returned to inside the pressurized mating adapter and working on the APAS hatch and hatch opening procedures, as we continue to get great
Dragon
views from
Houston
inside
on the
the
big loop.
International Space
Com
Station.
check. Hardline audio configuration complete, and we have resolved the audio issues on C2V2.
That sounds great, because we have you loud and clear.
We read you the same.
And that was a good communications checkout The team's on the ground up to Dragon Grace on the C2V2 line, common communications for visiting vehicles, and that communications line connecting all parties. As we continue to work through hatch opening procedures, and again targeting approximately 8:35 a.m. Central Time for welcoming remarks as the International Space Station and Expedition 73 crew bring in and welcome aboard Axiom Mission 4. Both the orbiting laboratory and the newly docked SpaceX Dragon spacecraft over the northern Pacific Ocean, about to cross into the west coast of North America, right along the U.S.-Canadian border. And also around that time, we will start seeing an orbital daytime period as Dragon and the International Space Station have been orbiting in a nighttime phasing. Currently experiencing a satellite handover period, and we'll continue to bring you the live views from the International Space Station, both inside or exterior. Once communications is established, which should be here in the next few moments. Until then, you can see on this map where exactly we're talking about, where the station and Dragon orbiting over the Pacific Ocean and about to cross over North America and over the northernmost territories of Canada. As we wait for those communications to return, to recap, Axiom Mission 4 has connected with the International Space Station after launching from NASA's Kennedy Space Center yesterday morning at 1:31 a.m. Central Time to connect with the space station at 5:31 a.m. Central this morning. So a little more than a day's transit, and where it would execute a sequence of burns to raise its altitude and close the distance between Dragon spacecraft, Dragon Grace, and the International Space Station through a phase burn, boost burn, close burn, transfer burn, and then eventually the co-elliptic burn, to make sure that the spacecraft is on the same pathway as the International Space Station and able to make its way up and over top of it to connect to the space-facing port of the Harmony module, the Node 2 Zenith port. As we now get views back inside of the International Space Station, that is the view from the other side. We mentioned the space-facing port that is looking up into where the hatchways will be to allow for the Axiom Mission 4 crew to pass through and be brought aboard the International Space Station. For Peggy Whitson, commander of Axiom Mission 4, her second flight as an Axiom commander after previously serving as commander of Axiom Mission 2. This is her 5th flight and return to the International Space Station, where she continues to build on an impressive career, the most experienced United States astronaut entered the mission with 675 days to her credit, and will certainly add to that record-setting total in her time aboard the orbiting laboratory, and bringing up pilot Shubhanshu Shukla of ISRO, Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski of Polsa, and Tibor Kapu of Hunor. And for Shukla, Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Kapu, representing India, Poland, and Hungary, respectively, for those nations, it'll be their first time coming to the International Space Station. Nicole Ayres. And the last one into the hatch, I believe that was Anne McLean, making her way in as they continue to work through hatch opening procedures. In the middle there, that is Expedition 73 Commander Takuya Onishi of JAXA. And then you just momentarily saw NASA astronaut Johnny Kim float in and out of view as the crew working together to continue these procedures, moving around some equipment, and to allow for the access to the APAS hatch. After successful vestibule pressurization and checks. And that's the operations that Nicole Ayres is working on right now with Takuya Onishi. And Johnny Kim with camera in hand to document these procedures. And again, just on the other side of this hatchway is where the Axiom Mission 4 crew going through procedures of their own, inventory and doffing their suits that they wore on the uphill ride to their initial orbit. And after an off-duty period would put back on for those dynamic phases of flight, starting with the approach initiation burn that occurred earlier this morning. If you are just joining us, good morning from Mission Control in Houston in the International Space Station Flight Control Room, as we are looking live inside of the International Space Station as NASA astronauts Nicole Ayres and Anne McLean, alongside with Commander of Expedition 73 and JAXA astronaut Takuya Onishi, going through a hatch opening procedures. And there you can see as the team has worked together to open up that APAS hatch and continue on with those procedures to welcome aboard eventually the Axiom Mission 4 crew with the welcome remarks.
Currently still targeting. Big Blue, the APAS hatch is open and no condensation observed on the field.
Houston copies. Looks great. Thank you.
And a perfect call down right there, as that is the APAS hatch that we were just mentioning that Nicole Ayres and team have opened up, and radioing down the status and condition of that hatch with no condensation reported. And as Nicole Ayers continues to work on that hatch, you'll also see that hatch be covered up to give an extra level of safety to allow for the Axiom Mission 4 team to pass smoothly without having to worry about any additional hazards as they pass through the vestibule and pressurized mating adapter and eventually into the Harmony module of the International Space Station. Another step in this hatch opening procedure is the removal of the docking cross, which it looks like that is what Nicole Ayers is working on as we speak. And you sometimes catch glimpses of it on the docking procedures that was exposed to the vacuum of space to help provide targeting for visiting vehicles. But that'll be another step in this hatch opening process, again, to help clear the way for that pass-through between the Dragon SpaceX Grace spacecraft and the International Space Station. Hatch opening procedures continuing to move along for the teams aboard the International Space Station and Axiom Mission 4 as we draw closer and closer to the anticipated hatch opening and eventual welcome remarks. And we thank you for tuning in and joining us this morning as we are live from the International Space Station Flight Control Room in Houston, Texas, monitoring Nicole Ayers as she continues to work through those step-by-step procedures. As the hatchway, there you see the large square structure just off to the right-hand side of our field of view with that window in the middle was
Station
opened up.
Houston on the big loop. Just want to clarify, we want the standoff cross stowed in the standoff cross cover bag.
Houston Station copies.
And that's the teams here on the ground assisting the astronauts on board the station with those hatch opening procedures. As again, that zenith hatchway we were just mentioning before the comms open to the right that allowed Nicole Ayers and team to pass through. And that docking cross that was just removed will be inserted into its own bag. And there is NASA astronaut Ann McLean to join Ayers in the hatchway and continue on with those procedures as they now look to cover up the APAS hatch, which was just opened a few moments ago, to provide an extra layer of safety and protection for astronauts passing through.
SpaceX Dragon, suit drying is complete.
And Dragon, we copy on the big loop, suit drying complete.
Good insight there from the Axiom Mission 4 perspective of their procedures that they are currently going through in anticipation of hatch opening, and welcome remarks as they make their way into the International Space Station after connecting and docking to the International Space Station about an hour and a half ago. 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern. They went through their procedures, inventory, and stowage, and the doffing of their suits that they wore from launch yesterday morning from Cape Canaveral, Florida, and NASA's Kennedy Space Center, and then during the dynamic portions of operations, and are now settling into their flight suits that they will bring in and wear as they cruise into the International Space Station. And that's the view we see from the orbiting laboratory is NASA astronaut Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers working through their procedures for hatch opening. The APAS hatch is open after successful vestibule pressurization and checks. They are now covering up that APAS hatch.
And SpaceX Dragon in step 5 of 2.102. We're waiting your go for hatch open.
Dragon, SpaceX copies on the big loop. You are standing by for hatch opening. We are waiting for hardline connections to be complete. I'll call back with a go.
Okay, thanks. Sorry to rush you.
And there you heard Axiom Mission 4 Commander Peggy Whitson radioing out to the team at SpaceX. They are awaiting the go for hatch opening. I'd imagine the crew aboard the Dragon Gray spacecraft anxious and excited to float into the International Space Station for the very first time. And you just saw that orange ductwork or hose-like piece of equipment that Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers were just operating with. That's a part of helping mix the air between the International Space Station and the Dragon spacecraft. They'll continue to check some vent valves as well, so it just might be a little bit more time before we welcome the crew on board. But these final checks, again, critical to making sure that everything is good and sealed tight with no leaks and no issues, as Dragon Grace will be docked to the International Space Station for approximately the next 2 weeks.
Houston, SpaceX station is ready for Dragon hatch equalization.
Houston, copy. Stand by.
Another step in those hatch opening procedures is Nicole Ayers just radioed down for the SpaceX Dragon hatch pressurization and equalization. As you see the pop of flash bulbs aboard the International Space Station being documented, and plenty of smiles from the Expedition 73 crew as we draw closer and closer to hatch opening and welcoming Axiom Mission 4 aboard the orbital outpost. Meanwhile, here on the ground inside NASA's Mission Control, the International Space Station Flight Control Room, anticipation also building up as the room starting to fill with NASA leadership, as well as the Athena flight team continuing to work through the hatch opening procedures. Flight Director Allison Bollinger closely monitoring every step of the way as Nicole Ayers is continuing to work through each checkpoint on her list. That's what you saw on the little tablet that she was referring to, making sure every step is covered as she has now floated back into the pressurized mating adapter across the APAS hatch.
Station Houston on the big loop. We're still working some ground config actions before we're ready for equalization. In the meantime, can we get confirmation that the standoff cross went into the standoff cross bag? We were unable to tell from the video.
It was in there when you guys called. Thanks.
Copy, thanks.
Hearing communications from teams on the ground as they continue to work through hatch opening procedures and making sure all pressurization and leak checks are good and everything equal between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station before the hatches can be formally opened on both sides. You can see into this hatchway the space-facing port, or into the space-facing side of the Harmony module aboard the International Space Station and the International Docking Adapter that welcomed the connection of Axiom Mission 4 at 5:31 a.m. Central Time earlier this morning. And since then, the crews aboard both the Dragon Gray spacecraft and International Space Station have been diligently working and continue to monitor the progress of that hatch opening with teams on the ground also following suit.
Station Dragon Houston on the big loop. Stand by for equalization. Expected to take 1 minute.
Station copies 1 minute. Dragon copies 1 minute.
Great communications there from all teams here at NASA's Johnson Space Center and International Space Station Mission Control Room, teams in the SpaceX in Hawthorne, California, and everyone aboard the Dragon SpaceX Grace in Axiom Mission 4 and the International Space Station as we continue to march towards the hatch opening to welcome Axiom Mission 4 aboard the orbiting laboratory.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, you are go for hatch opening per the decal, followed by the remaining actions in procedure 4.400, section 6.
Dragon copies. Go for hatch open and remainder of steps in 4.400.
We are go for hatch opening is what you have just heard. If you are just now joining us, you are tuned into live coverage of the arrival of Axiom Mission 4, the International Space Station.
And SpaceX Dragon, hatch is coming open.
SpaceX copies.
Expedition 73 crew anxiously awaiting as we just received the go for hatch opening to welcome Axiom Mission 4 into the International Space Station. There you see Ann McLean in the foreground working on the tablet, alongside with Johnny Kim on the far right-hand side, NASA astronaut, and then Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov next to him, with Alexei Zubritsky and Sergei Ryzhikov, also of Roscosmos, in that mix. And right there in the middle, almost standing, if you will, from our perspective, is Expedition 73 Commander and JAXA astronaut Takuya Onishi. From this view, they are looking up.
SpaceX Dragon, hatch is open at 12:14, and we're requesting the go for the LIO change.
Copy 12:14 Zulu hatch opening time, and you are go for LIO swap.
And there you heard that the hatch is open and confirmed at 7:14 a.m. Central Time, as the hatches are open between SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft and the International Space Station. Again, 7:14 a.m. Central, 8:14 a.m. Eastern. And you heard also the swaps of the LIO canisters. That's the lithium hydroxide cartridges that scrub the carbon dioxide inside of the Dragon spacecraft on the ride to the International Space Station. Also, Nicole Ayers out of view, but if from this perspective, looking up, she is operating with the Axiom Mission 4 team to help refresh the air and cycle air between the two craft as they continue a few more procedures before floating across and into the orbiting laboratory for the first time.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop for LIO cartridge.
Go ahead for LIO cartridge.
Just looking for clarification on your next action there. We're tracking LIO cartridge sealing per 2.102 step 6.5.
Oh, okay. And in my procedure, I had for the instructions on the decal for section. For section 4 of the instructions on the decal.
And copy that, Peggy. We'll defer to the instructions in 2.102.
Okay, that's where we are.
You just heard communications between Axiom Mission 4 Commander Peggy Whitson and the teams on the ground as they were talking about the swapping of the lithium hydroxide cartridges as the hatch has been opened between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station just a few moments ago at 7:14 a.m. Central Time. And this is a view inside the International Space Station, looking forward, if you will, as the astronauts and cosmonauts aboard are looking up. That is towards the space-facing port of the Harmony module. That's where they are in now. If you were to keep going forward, if you will, that is the forward port, which currently is occupied by Dragon Endurance from Crew 10. And a great microgravity demonstration of the camera that Alexei Zubritsky is using to help document and be a part of the welcoming committee for Axiom Mission 4 here in the next few moments.
Dragon Houston on the big loop. Just to confirm, we want to make sure IMV duct installation is complete before we do LIO cartridge sealing.
Yes, the IMV duct installation is complete. My bad, I didn't get it reported.
Houston copies.
Now we switch views from pretty much the point of view of what the astronauts have been looking at. From what we have seen, they were looking up, and this is the shot up into that node to zenith hatchway of the Harmony module. That is Nicole Ayers, NASA astronaut, just on the other side of that APAS hatchway, working with the Axiom Mission 4 crew. You heard them talking about IMV ducting and LIO cartridges. That IMV ducting helps mix the air of the International Space Station environment with the air inside of Dragon. And then also looking to seal up some of those lithium hydroxide cartridges that are used to scrub carbon dioxide from the air in the spacecraft on their journey to the International Space Station. And that journey started yesterday morning, 1:31 a.m. Central Time, 2:31 a.m. Eastern, as they would launch on the SpaceX Dragon, newly named Grace spacecraft, on a Falcon 9 rocket from Launch Pad 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center, and would chase down the International Space Station earlier this morning at 5:31, nearly 2 hours ago, 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern, a little bit more of a day's transit.
Houston and SpaceX Dragon arrival configuration is complete.
Houston copies.
SpaceX copies.
Continuing to target a welcome ceremony or welcome remarks in the near future at 8:35 a.m. Central Time. So a little bit more than an hour from now is Axiom Mission 4 and the International Space Station continuing to work through hatch opening procedures, but getting close, you can start to see a little bit of a window of opportunity that was just on the other side of astronaut Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers there, as they are working on IMV ducting, mixing the air of the station and Dragon, and lithium hydroxide cartridges, stowage and swapping out. So Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers are starting to clear out the hatchway, and we are going to see the first views of Axiom Mission 4. Commander Peggy Whitson, the first one across the A-Pass hatch, receiving great big hugs from Nicole Ayers and the Expedition 73 crew. Axiom Mission 4, welcome aboard the International Space Station. Pilot Shubhanshu Shukla is the next one to come across, representing ISRO. It is his first space flight for Peggy Whitson, her return to the International Space Station on her 5th flight, second as a member of Axiom Space. Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski of ESA, representing the nation of Poland. And their first visit to the International Space Station is next to cross the hatchway. And warm hugs all around. And applause breaking out here inside of Mission Control Houston and International Space Station Flight Control Room. And Tibor Kapu, the fourth and final member of Axiom Mission 4, representing Hunor and the nation of Hungary. Their first visit to the International Space Station as well. Great big hugs and handshakes across all members of Expedition 73 and Axiom Mission 4 is Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers of NASA, along with Johnny Kim, Kirill Peskov, Sergei Ryzhikov, and Alexei Zabritsky of Roscosmos, and Takuya Onishi, commander of Expedition 73 and of JAXA, with handshakes and hugs for Peggy Whitson, Shubhanshu Shukla, Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Tibor Kapu. And with their arrival to the International Space Station, that now makes 288 visitors to the orbiting laboratory. Axiom Mission 4 is now aboard the International Space Station. Commander Peggy Whitson, in her return to the orbiting laboratory, her 5th flight. 3 is a member of NASA, and her 2nd as commander of Axiom and Axiom Space private astronaut mission, commander of Axiom 2 and here of Axiom 4. Regaling the crew with smiles and stories. To her left, or our left from her viewpoint, to her right, Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski of ESA, Shubhanshu Shukla to her left of ISRO, and Tibor Kapu on that far right-hand side of our viewpoint. The crew is safely aboard the International Space Station. Welcome again to Axiom Mission 4. And we are continuing to target a formal welcome remark from the crew and being joined by the Expedition 73 team as well. That'll be at approximately 8:35 a.m. Central Time. And from there, they will receive a safety briefing and begin their nearly approximately 2-week mission aboard the International Space Station, in which they will participate in around 60 research investigations representing 31 countries, with more than 24 of those experiments sponsored by the ISS National Lab. And there they all are, waving back at our coverage here inside of the International Space Station Flight Control Room.
Station Houston on 2. Thanks for the wave. Great to see everybody.
Houston Station, we're happy to be here. It's so great to be here finally. It was a long quarantine.
And with the crew now in the space station, we're going to wrap up our portion of the live joint coverage from Hawthorne. It's been an honor to support Axiom Mission 4 thus far, and we wish the crew a successful time on the space station. We're, of course, also looking forward to joining AX4 again when it's time to return home.
Ronnie, from launch to docking, it has been an absolute pleasure sharing this desk with you. What has been years in the making for India, Poland, and Hungary is now well underway. Axiom Space and NASA's joint coverage will continue from here through to the welcome ceremony as Peggy, Shubhanshu, Sławomir, and Tibor start their 2 weeks aboard the orbiting laboratory. Over the course of our crew's time on station, we will be producing mission updates from Axiom Space's own space station development facility in Houston, Texas. So we invite you to follow the progress of AX4 on axiomspace.com and through Axiom Space's social media channels.
So with that, on behalf of SpaceX, Axiom Space, and NASA, thank you all for tuning in to watch. While our stream on X is coming to a close, coverage of the welcome ceremony now continues on NASA Plus, axiom.space/live, and Axiom Space's social channels. With that, we'll turn it back over to you, Joseph. Have a great morning, everyone, and go AX4.
Go AX4.
We continue on with our live coverage of the arrival of Axiom Mission 4 to the International Space Station, the fourth private astronaut mission to arrive to the orbital outpost, and the first since January of 2024. We just saw the crew of 4, including Commander Peggy Whitson, Shubhanshu Shukla, pilot of ISRO, Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Tibor Kapu of ESA and Hunor, respectively, crossed the hatchway and into the orbital outpost for the very first time. We're continuing to follow along as we'll wait for the formal welcoming remarks that are currently scheduled for roughly 8:35 a.m. Central Time, so a little bit more than an hour to go as the crew continues to settle in. After you heard the remarks from Peggy Whitson mentioning the long quarantine, the ride up, which took a little bit more than a day's time to do so, as the teams here in the International Space Station Flight Control Room and special guests in the viewing room at the back of your screen on hand to witness this special moment.